The light emitted by the lamp's core was extremely viscous, like water that had been infused with quite a bit of sugar. It spewed out, forming a distorted and blurry golden figure. This figure instantly occupied the crimson star representing the hermit, cutting off his ability to sense Katlia. Sitting at the end of the long bronze table, Klein's eyes widened as a thought subconsciously flashed across his mind, as expected of a sealed artifact labeled 005. Although the serial number of Grade 0 sealed artifacts was usually based on the order of the time the Orthodox churches obtained or understood them, it had to be known that this set of rules was officially established after the 7 churches truly ruled over the world, which was the late 4th epoch and early 5th epoch. Back then, most Grade 0 sealed artifacts had already appeared, and they had been learned of or obtained by the Orthodox churches. This resulted in a situation where the ones with smaller serial numbers being Grade 0 sealed artifacts that were more powerful, terrifying, and unimaginable. Then, the rest were labeled based on the order of appearance. In addition, although it wasn't wrong to say that an item was more powerful the more ancient it was, for an item from the first epoch that the ancient gods were unable to affect, it definitely meant that even deities didn't fully comprehend their secrets. This way, the smaller the number was, the more terrifying the Grade 0 sealed artifact was. Of course, based on this rule, the Grade 0 sealed artifacts with higher serial numbers weren't necessarily worse than the first 10. Perhaps it was simply because they were discovered or obtained by the church at a later date. Without any numbers left for them, they could only be serialized. Just as a thought flashed through his mind, the golden figure's gaze pierced through the crimson star representing the hermit and towards the ancient palace above the grey fog. Following that, his voice echoed in an unusually magnificent manner, "Long time no see. Long time no see. Long time no see." He knows the former owner of Sephira Castle, the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. No, it should be him, a genie who claims to be eternal. He can actually use Ma'am Hermit's prayer to directly talk to me. A thought flashed through Klein's mind as he tensed up. Based on his experience over the recent years, as well as his ability as a clown, his body suddenly relaxed and he leisurely leaned back into his chair. Following that, Klein replied, "Hey." He didn't give an affirmative answer, nor did he deny that he was a fake. He only showed a look of contempt and wore a supercilious look. The blurry golden figure harumphed. "You've actually been weakened so much. It's no wonder that I haven't heard of your honorific name in the past few millennia." Honorific name. Weak. He really knows the former owner of Sephira Castle. Is that an existence who was active during the first epoch? Amidst his thoughts, Klein smiled and said, "What you see might not be the truth." Ha ha. The twisted and blurry golden figure laughed and said, "You're still your usual self, always trying to scam others, but the condition of Sephira Castle cannot fool me. Under normal circumstances, there's no way for me to pass through the outer layers of protection to communicate with you. How do you know that I didn't do it on purpose?" Klein asked in a relaxed manner. "There's no point in lying to me," the distorted, blurry golden genie immediately replied. "Why do I feel like the victim of fraud is saying that I'm penniless, to the point of having sold my kidney? Back then, what did the previous owner of Sephira Castle, the one suspected to be the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings, do to the genie? Part of the characteristics of this magic wishing lamp is that of a miracle invoker." Using his lampooning to relieve the pressure in his heart, Klein smiled. "It's not up to you to decide whether there's any point." The blurry golden figure trembled slightly. "From the state of Sephira Castle, you seem to have a need for a miracle invoker beyond a characteristic." He did not harp on the topic and instead pointed out the situation he had observed. "This fellow can actually see through this matter. His level is really very high. He is able to separate the miracle invoker beyond a characteristic from the magic wishing lamp." Klein's eyes narrowed as he nearly lost his composure. He immediately controlled his actions and expression and replied with a smile, "If you think so." The blurry and distorted golden figure once again made his magnificent voice echo above the grey fog. "We can make a deal. You will remove my seal and give me freedom. I will leave the miracle invoker beyond a characteristic to you and only take away the portion that belongs to me. As for a witness, let's use our Sephira. Although both you and I have means to resist the backlash and reduce the damage caused by breaching the contract, it won't be without a price. We both need to consider the consequences. I promise I won't stay here any longer than necessary." Sealed. Sephiro. The terrifying nature of the magic wishing lamp is a seal of an existence that's at least at the true deity level. With a thought, Klein quickly analyzed the viability of the matter. Soon, he made a decision. He was not to be bewitched. There were two reasons for this. Firstly, he wasn't the real owner of Sephira Castle. There was a limit to what he could do and handle. Secondly, he had received some mysticism education and had gleaned experiences as a Nighthawk. He knew not to trade with unknown existences or bear any hope in being lucky. Having made up his mind, he calmed down and focused on how to gather more information. The genie was suspected to originate from the darkest, most chaotic, and most mysterious First Epoch, so he definitely knew a lot. After some thought, the corners of Klein's mouth curled up. Do you think such conditions can move me? He planned to see how high the chips the genie could offer, so as to pry into certain of his secrets. Upon hearing this, the flickering golden figure's eyes suddenly lit up in a literal manner. His gaze seemed to land directly on Klein as his magnificent voice quaked the ancient palace like thunder. You are not him. You are not him. At that moment, Klein was a little stunned and also a little frightened. It was as if he was performing a grand magic show only to have a member of the audience suddenly point out his trick. He didn't know what was wrong with his rhetorical question, nor did he know what exactly was wrong. It was difficult for him to analyze the pros and cons in a short period of time, and give a reaction that matched the current situation. Why did he suddenly realize that I'm not the former owner of Sephira Castle, the suspected celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings? Isn't my rhetoric question very reasonable? Since we're talking about a deal, bargaining should be allowed. The former owner of Sephira Castle that the genie knew wasn't like that. Impossible. Why would a person who's good at deceit show his hand so readily? How can there not be some level of negotiation and pressure? *T. Too many thoughts are running through my mind. Nearly 10 seconds have passed. I didn't immediately answer the genie's accusation, so it's a form of indirect admittance. When it came to being exposed, Klein didn't have much experience. He was momentarily unsure for a response. Just as he raised his vigilance and was about to produce the Staff of the Stars and activate Sephira Castle's powers to resist the possible attack from the genie, the golden and blurry figure suddenly laughed. Ha ha. Ha ha ha. Ha ha ha. This laughter seemed to stir his soul, causing Klein, who was inside Sephira Castle, to nearly show signs of losing control. It wasn't easy for him to remain calm. There's no intention to attack, but the influence of natural dissipation. What's the genie laughing about? What's so funny? Klein frowned as he thought of one possibility after another, but he felt that they didn't match reality. After a few seconds, the genie's laughter stopped and he happily quipped, even for existences at our level, fate is still so miraculous. Regardless of who you are, the deal I proposed is still on the table. As long as you remove the seal and release me, I will return to the cosmos with the portion that belongs to me. As for the rest, I will leave the miracle invoker beyond a characteristic to you. In addition, I will grant you 3 wishes. How's that? Isn't that enough, Cosmos? When Klein heard that, his eyelids twitched as he sharply sensed danger. This was a warning from his spiritual intuition. He had originally thought that he could pretend to agree and obtain more information before using Sephira Castle to go back on his promise, but now he suddenly felt that he could not make the promise. Hence, Klein decisively said, "Leave." As he spoke, he cut off the connection between himself and the crimson star representing the hermit. The blurry and distorted golden figure suddenly expanded and dissipated, leaving only his voice echoing, "You will eventually agree." Only when the world above the grey fog had its calm completely restored did Klein slowly let out a breath and silently mutter to himself, "The genie is a powerful creature from the cosmos." Was it sealed within the magical wishing lamp in the First Epoch or earlier? The person who sealed him might be the previous owner of Sephira Castle, the existence suspected to be the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. This can be inferred from the ingredients used to form the magic wishing lamp's beyonder characteristics. So, that's how the genie sensed that I wasn't the previous owner of Sephira Castle when he questioned me. But I did consider this point, so my question wasn't logically unsound. Unless, back then, the former owner of Sephira Castle and the genie had come to some sort of tacit understanding or had some secret. The bulk of the genie's powers likely can't extend out of the seal, but he can use the beyonder characteristic that forms the seal. The unique characteristic of granting wishes is likely from the miracle invoker characteristic. Then, the genie uses his level to magnify it. Amidst his thoughts, Klein raised his head to look at the crimson star representing the hermit. He discovered that Katlia didn't notice anything unusual with the magic wishing lamp. Phew, Klein formed a stream of light that contained his warnings and threw it into the Crimson Star, the primitive island that the Emperor found by chance. The creatures on the island worship an unknown power that comes from the cosmos. Without reaching the level of an angel, just knowledge of it will result in corruption from the cosmos. Try not to make a wish to the genie, nor bring it to that primitive island. Katlia finally received feedback from Mr. Fool as she heaved a sigh of relief, even more worried about the Queen's quest. She turned her head to look at the unresponsive magic wishing lamp and quickly put it away. Then, she spread out a letter, picked up a fountain pen, and paraphrased the information she had just received, hoping that Queen Mystic Bernadette would take it seriously. In a dilapidated apartment in Backland, a man with a full beard was sitting on a chair with his hands cuffed behind him. Zio, who had become a middle-ranking MI9 member through her own capabilities, stood in front of the man, with a triangular blade in hand and her two subordinates flanking her. We already have enough witnesses and evidence to prove that you're one of the main organizers of the protest. If you wish to reduce your punishment, answer my questions honestly. Before Zio could say a word, the bearded man felt an extremely powerful suppressive force. When she finished speaking, even his mind began to tremble. It was as though bolts of electricity were generated and a pain and numbness that couldn't be perceived could explode at any moment. The bearded man suppressed the fear and weakness in his heart and said, "No one instigated me. I just did what I wanted to do. Don't you all know? The entirety of Backland has become a gunpowder keg. Even a tiny spark can set off the entire city. And there are countless sparks like me who are willing to take the risk. Those darn nobles and merchants hoarded so much food while there are already people in East Borough who are starving to death. You can do whatever you want to do to me. I've never believed in their promises. The reason why we agreed to end the protest was because everyone had received a lot of food." Zio was about to ask further when she suddenly turned her head to listen to the commotion in the distance. Sounds of rumbling could be heard from somewhere. It was deep, hoarse, and layered. Has the Fazak, Intis, or Finepotter army broken through our defenses and begun to attack Backland's defenses? Zio's expression instantly turned solemn. Back in the forsaken land of the gods, after Klein returned to the real world, he immediately attempted to reach out his hand to see if he could pull out the magic wishing lamp from the fog of history. Soon, he confirmed that he couldn't summon sealed artifact 005. Indeed, it involves a uniqueness, or should I say, Sephira. In short, the genie is indeed a high-ranking existence that was sealed. At the very least, he is a king of angels. There's no way to make use of him. Klein let out a breath and turned his attention back to the hunt of dark demonic wolf Kotar. He had made a lot of preparations during this period of time, and he ran through and confirmed the plan above the grey fog. However, he was in no hurry to take action. He spent quite a bit of time checking the loopholes and mending the imperfections. 2 to 3 days later, it was dark and silent in the wilderness. Wearing a silk top hat and a long black trench coat, Klein held a lantern that emitted a faint yellow glow. With a solemn expression, he reached out his right hand and grabbed at the air. At that moment, a bolt of lightning streaked across the world, illuminating it. Following that, he dragged out a figure. It was him holding the illusory staff of the stars and a lantern. Right on the heels of that, his true body entered the fog of history as he dashed through a time before the first epoch. He hid inside the old stacked cities. His historical void projection suddenly came alive as an area that he had been exploring recently had surfaced in his mind. He used the power of the staff of the stars to directly move to it. This was a huge distance away from where his actual body was. Even if there was a problem with the projection, no one would be able to lock onto the exact location of where his true body was when he returned to reality. Surveying the area, he took in the dried riverbed and a boulder that stood deep in the darkness like a monster. He no longer maintained his staff of the stars historical projection, letting it quickly fade away and disappear with a shake of his right hand. After doing all of this, he walked to the boulder, put down the lantern, and began chanting an honorific name in Jotun, the Dark Lord that exists alongside history, the embodiment of countless miracles, the God of wishes. This was the dark demonic wolf's honorific name that he had obtained from the Evernite goddess. Although the mythical creature might not be using it anymore, or had perhaps changed it a long time ago, it was undoubtedly referring to him when it came to mysticism. Deep within a mountain range, in an ancient castle, giants, elves, humans, and vampires each held the role as gardeners, chefs, servants, and guards. They all had different expressions and would whisper to each other when they met, making them appear lively and intelligent. However, once they returned to their rooms, they would immediately turn dull. Their eyes would no longer move as their bodies floated up and hung from the ceiling. In the depths of the castle, in a hall where only lightning could light it up from outside the window, a huge figure lay quietly in the darkness. Its body was like a tiny mountain that was covered in dark short fur. Its pitch-black pupils covered at least 3/4 of its eyes, and at its forehead was a tuft of grayish-white fur. Its head resembled a magnified, twisted feral wolf. This was none other than the god of wishes, dark demonic wolf Kotar. Suddenly, this demonic wolf, which was more exaggerated than an ordinary giant, raised his head. Every strand of his dark and short hair began to sway as all the servants in the castle followed his actions. Kotar's eyes moved slightly as he turned his head slightly, as though he was listening to something. In the next second, he opened his mouth and let out a soundless roar and summoned another him. As soon as this dark demonic wolf appeared, Kotar's body leaped into the grayish-white fog as he dashed to a certain historical spot of light in the Second Epoch. This was a piece of secret history that he knew. In the real world, the dark demonic wolf's historical void projection made a wish in a tongue-twisting language. Then, with a flash of his figure, he directly moved to a mountain near the northern city of Noise. After making the necessary preparations, the god of wishes allowed a strand of dark, short hair to fall off, turning into an illusory worm of spirit that expanded into the corresponding prayer point of light. With its help, Kotar saw who was praying to him. It was a young man wearing a strange hat and strange clothes. He stood beside a glass lantern and softly chanted the honorific name of the god of wishes. The dark demonic wolf's huge, pitch-black pupils turned and saw that the young man was covered in a layer of grayish-white fog. There were some things that could not be seen clearly in the fog. As a Sequence 2 angel of the seer pathway, this mythical creature could clearly sense that the fog was similar to the fog of history. It could sense a strong attraction force from something in the fog. Saphira Castle. Having heard some matters from the ancient god, Phlegrea, the king of demonic wolves, he instantly had a guess. Under this premise, he had many thoughts regarding the young man. Using Saphira Castle to attract me and make me attack him on my own accord, and then confirming my location. This is a bait. Indeed, he's just a historical void projection. It's unknown which time fragment his true body is hiding in. It's unknown where the ambusher is hiding. Previously, Saphira Castle clearly had an anomaly. I controlled myself and didn't attempt to search for the corresponding region or the clues that might be left behind. Why do they think I will fall for it? It's just an attempt, switching to another when it doesn't work. Or is there something wrong with this prayer? I've lived for thousands of years. After experiencing so many things, what kind of situation have I not seen? The best solution now is to ignore him and not spy on him. I'll just remember him. The dark demonic wolf quickly made a decision and planned to observe for a while longer before destroying that prayer point of light. At this moment, he saw the young man open his mouth again. The sun that is eternal, you are an inextinguishable light, you are the embodiment of order. Quote. The dark demonic wolf was somewhat puzzled as to what the young man was trying to do. In this forsaken land, praying to the other true deities was useless. In the next second, Klein once again chanted another deity's name, the Lord that created everything, the Lord who reigns behind the curtain of shadows, the degenerated nature of all living things. The dark demonic wolf's pupils dilated slightly. He was confused by the actions of the human in the prayer light. Before he could make any guesses, Klein muttered the third honorific name, the clock hand that tampers with time, the shadow that roams across fate, the embodiment of deceit and trickery. Amen. He is praying to Amen. The dark demonic wolf was already completely at a loss as to what the other party was up to. He instinctively felt that something was amiss and immediately wanted to wipe away the corresponding prayer point of light. Suddenly, he saw the young man lift his head and smile. He then took out a crystal monocle and put it on his right eye. In just one prayer, Klein's historical void projection had turned into blasphemer Amen's avatar. Almost at the same time, the dark demonic wolf felt the other party's gaze pass through the prayer light and land on him. Then, Amen looked past him, and into the fog of history where his true body was. Without any hesitation, he immediately destroyed the prayer light. As for his true body, he dispelled the gaze and removed the maintenance of the historical projection. In the fog of history, in the stacked city of old, Klein suddenly stood up. A scene surfaced in his mind. A few seconds before this scene took shape, he had severed the connection between his body and the historical void projection, doing so in order to avoid having Eamon descend right beside him. The baffling actions that he had previously done were mainly to confuse the dark demonic wolf. He wanted him to continue observing after realizing that the supplicant wasn't the true body. This made him increase the time he spied on Sephira Castle. In the end, he prayed to Eamon, using the possible descent and influence of the god of deceit to hide the tracks of Sephira Castle's reverse corruption of the dark demonic wolf. If Eamon hadn't responded and merely watched by the sidelines, Klein would use the monocle he had prepared to deceive the dark demonic wolf. Deep within a mountain range, in the ancient castle. As soon as dark demonic wolf Kotar returned from the fog of history, he instinctively removed all connections with the outside world. He was prepared to abandon this place and move elsewhere. Although he still hadn't figured out what had happened, with an accident already happening, his experience told him that he couldn't take any chances at all. He should retreat and give up as required of him. At the same time, a thought came to Klein's mind in the city of old. His figure instantly appeared in the ancient palace above the grey fog. At the seat belonging to the fool, he merged with the constantly distorted and scattered crimson figure and took form. In this mysterious space, the crimson stars that represented justice, the hanged man, the star, and the other members of the Tarot Club were constantly expanding and shrinking. They emitted layers of ripples that formed a mighty wave. This was one of the preparations that Klein had made in advance. In the name of Gehrman Sparrow, he had used different reasons to get the members of the Tarot Club to pray to Mr. Fool one after another, asking this existence to pass a certain answer to Mr. World. As such, the crimson stars resonated, affecting Sephira Castle in reverse, thus allowing it to summon the Fool to resolve the problem. This was one of the key factors that could help him escape from Eamon's clutches. It could help him remove the need to take 4 steps counterclockwise and recite the incantations. He could directly enter Sephira Castle without wasting any time. And in a battle at the level of angels, the difference a second makes would perhaps determine the difference in the outcome. To fight someone more powerful than him, Klein had to consider every detail. Sitting in the high back chair belonging to the Fool, he beckoned for the staff of the stars and sea god scepter while observing the other changes in Sephira Castle. In the grayish-white fog, there was an additional crimson glow that was rapidly shrinking, almost disappearing in no time. Around the Fool's seat, ripples of light bloomed as though they were forming a pure passageway. He could barely make out a gigantic demonic wolf's figure from the crimson glow. This was a result of Kotar's spying on Sephira Castle. Through the passage of time, he had gained a certain understanding of the situation and had unknowingly been invaded. As such, he established a preliminary connection with Sephira Castle. Of course, as an angel and a god of wishes of the Second Epoch, he had the right level and ability to sever such a connection and get rid of the corresponding corruption. If Klein didn't make use of these 1 or 2 seconds, he would lose his lock on the dark demonic wolf. And at the side of the Fool's seat, the rippling lights reflected the figure wearing a half-top hat and a long black trench coat, Gehrman Sparrow. On his right eye was a crystal monocle. Eamon. It was unknown what loophole this blasphemer's avatar could use to slow down the rate at which Klein's historical void projection dissipated. Then, he used the subtle connection between Gehrman Sparrow, Klein's actual body, and Sephira Castle in an attempt to invade the world above the grey fog from the special scene summoned by Sephira Castle. As the halo spread out, Gehrman Sparrow's long and powerful palm pierced through the barrier and suddenly entered the ancient palace, as though it had opened an invisible door. Although Klein had already prepared for this and knew that it wouldn't be easy to get rid of Eamon, he couldn't help but feel his scalp tingle when he saw this scene. He was afraid that in the next second, he would grab a crystal monocle and put it on his right eye. This was something that had to be resolved in 1 or 2 seconds. Otherwise, the ownership of Sephira Castle would be a question left in the air. Without any hesitation, distorted and transparent worms of spirit appeared on the surface of his skin. They quickly gathered together, forming another Klein. After catching the sea god scepter, Klein stirred the power of Sephira Castle. With the augmentation of the layers of invisible waves, the blue gems lit up, causing violent bolts of lightning to form silver balls that rolled into the rippling light. Amidst the crackling sounds, the palm that pierced through Sephira Castle instantly shattered and evaporated. The spherical lightning that was filled with destructive aura expanded outwards, descending into reality, enveloping the monocled Gehrman Sparrow. This historical void projection was only barely maintained with the use of loopholes, so it collapsed after suffering such a strike. He could only adjust the crystal monocle and shake his head in regret as he watched his figure rapidly fade away after being shattered by the electric bolts. As a small portion of the worms of spirit responded to Amon's prayer, Klein grabbed the Staff of the Stars with his actual body. He held the staff embedded with many gems and aimed the Grade 0 sealed artifact at the rapidly shrinking crimson light. At the same time, a scene appeared in his mind. The rubies, emeralds, sapphires, and pearls on the Staff of the Stars lit up one after another. Gong! The sound of a distant bell seemed to have transcended an infinite amount of time as it echoed within the grayish-white fog, reverberating within the crimson light. The pitch-black darkness in front of dark demonic wolf Kotar suddenly faded, revealing a huge stone wall clock. The wall clock was ancient and mottled, and its surface was grayish-white and bluish-black, split into 12 segments. Each segment had different symbols that represented the different times of the day. At the core of the wall clock, 3 needles seemed to be formed from worms of time of 3 different lengths, short, medium, and long, were filled with a feeling that time had left its mark on. This was a beyond a power from Angel of Time, Amon. Using the Staff of the Stars, Klein had made it appear again. Normally speaking, a beyond a power at this level wasn't something that could be understood by just witnessing once or twice. It wasn't so easy to record it, but Klein wasn't fighting alone. During this period of time, he had made use of Miss Magician's summoning to return to Bakland frequently. He went to the Star Leonard to chat directly with Palais Zoroast, and he gained a deeper understanding of the corresponding mysticism knowledge and supernatural details. Although Palais had already dropped to the Sequence 2 level and was unable to use the powers of the time domain, his experience and knowledge remained. Gong! On the ancient and mysterious stone wall clock, the second hand suddenly jerked, causing everything around dark demonic wolf Kotar to slow down. Even the deep darkness seemed to freeze. This miracle invoker, who was just about to completely cut off contact with the outside world and distance himself from where he was by granting his own wish, suddenly froze on the spot. There was a brief moment of him being fixed in place. There was no doubt that there was a huge gap in power between the original Beyonder powers and those replicated by the Staff of the Stars. However, for Klein, the effect was already enough. The moment he saw the dark demonic wolf being affected by the ancient wall clock, he immediately dropped the Staff of the Stars and made the worm of spirit he had just separated from his body to fly back into his body. With a thought, he returned to the City of Oil before the first epoch. Then, he appeared in the dark desolate plains with the lantern that emitted a faint yellow glow. His right hand extended forward and successfully pulled out a projection of the Staff of the Stars. This method could effectively increase the success rate of summoning the Staff of the Stars, but it would clearly reduce the might of this Grade 0 sealed artifact. After all, he was summoning a historical projection of a historical projection. Of course, as it was a race against time, making such a choice was very easy. Klein didn't enter the fog of history again. He reached out to grab his shoulder, and he used dream divination to outline the feedback he received from using Sephira Castle to reverse corrupt the dark demonic wolf. In the dark, unlit hall in the ancient castle, the mountain-like demonic wolf stood up. Quickly filling in the details, Klein slightly adjusted the details according to the scene of his frozen target. On the black staff, the corresponding gems lit up. In his mind, the scene that resembled an oil painting suddenly swelled up, interweaving with reality, making it impossible to separate from each other. He descended into that ancient castle's dark hall, landing in front of dark demonic wolf Kotar, who had just raised his body with his 8 legs. He had finally officially met the god of wishes that had been living since the second epoch. Without any hesitation, Klein took the opportunity of the dark demonic wolf having just escaped the influence of the ancient wall clock. As he dispelled the historical void projection, he took out an iron cigar case from his pocket and opened it. Inside the cigar case, there was a Loan gold coin. Its surface flashed, reflecting Rionette Tinnicker, who was wearing a dark and complicated long dress and holding 4 blonde, red-eyed heads. One of the preparations Klein made was to use the method that he had used to bring around Admiral of Blood Senor. This allowed him to bring Miss Messenger to the forsaken land of the gods. Rionette Tinnicker was no doubt a wraith. Furthermore, she was an even more powerful wraith. She could also possess the smooth surface of a gold coin. In addition, she was a spirit world creature and was intrinsically a spirit. She could enter the world above the grey fog and descend upon the forsaken land of the gods just like Justice Audrey. Based on this condition, in order to not expose the secret within Sephira Castle and not expose the fool's true identity, he first made Miss Messenger possess the gold coin before using the iron cigar case to seal it. Then, he sacrificed the item to the grey fog before bringing it to the forsaken land of the gods through a bestowment ritual. Of course, the prerequisite for these actions was that Klein had the level and strength of a Sequence 2 angel in Sephira Castle. Even if something went wrong with Rionette Tineke, he could still handle it. As for Rionette Tineke, she happily agreed to this matter because Gairman Sparrow had just helped her retrieve a portion of her body. Silently, Miss Messenger left the gold coin and occupied the pitch-black pupil of the dark demonic wolf's eyes. Wraith's possession. Just as Rionette Tineke's figure appeared in dark demonic wolf Qatar's pupils, she left the window to the heart and began expanding back to her original size. This meant that her Wraith's possession attempt had failed. The dark demonic wolf's body rapidly shrunk and thinned as he madly absorbed the light around him, becoming a translucent black velvet curtain. This was an item that Klein had seen via dream divination. It was ejected from the grayish-white fog and had landed in the hands of the dark demonic wolf. It was suspected to contain the Sequence 1 attendant of mysteries beyond a characteristic of the seer pathway. At this moment, dark demonic wolf Kotor had borrowed some of the powers of the curtain to dodge Rionette Tineke's Wraith's possession at the critical moment via some unknown means, effectively avoiding the subsequent series of control. The curtain was stowed away after he used it, allowing the dark demonic wolf with his dark, short fur to appear in a spot that was originally empty. Rionette Tineke wasn't surprised by the failure. Taking advantage of this opportunity, a golden-haired, red-eyed head in her hand spat out a rectangular, diamond-like charm. The other three heads used ancient Hermes, Jotun, and Elvish to say a word, yesterday. The rectangular diamond-like charm was instantly engulfed in transparent flames as it fused with the void. Rionette Tineke's body swelled as the four blonde, red-eyed heads flew up and landed on her empty neck, stacked upon one another. In the blink of an eye, Miss Messenger had transformed into a huge doll that could almost break through the dark demonic wolf's castle. She was wearing a black gothic dress with countless mysterious symbols and sinister vines. Her eyes were blood red and she exuded an aura that no human should possess. Dark demonic wolf Kotar didn't attempt to stop Rionette Tineke from borrowing strength from her past, nor did he immediately show his complete mythical creature form. With 8 feet on the ground, he raised his neck and let out a roar. This roar seemed to be of a higher level, containing words similar to Jotun. It made the curtain float up and instantly expand, blanketing the ancient castle from top to bottom. The curtain quickly turned transparent and fused with the building. It was as though it had never appeared or had any effect on it. However, Klein's spiritual intuition told him that this place was already isolated from the outside world. If he wanted to leave, he had to first break the invisible barrier. In other words, that curtain made the dark demonic wolf's castle become an independent kingdom. This was the embryonic form of a divine kingdom. Klein, who had just failed and planned on continuing to summon angels to help him, had a spark of inspiration. He instantly changed his mind, reaching into the void and dragging out another him. It was Gairman Sparrow, one who was holding a historical projection of the Staff of the Stars. Right on the heels of that, Klein controlled his historical projection to turn him into his marionette and transfer some worms of spirit over. While he was busy with these matters, Rionette Tineke had already recovered to her peak condition. Her bright red eyes reflected the 8-legged demonic wolf. With a faint flash, the dark demonic wolf turned into a white goat. However, outside the dark hall, a giant holding a broom suddenly trembled and transformed into a demonic wolf with a tuft of gray hair on its forehead. At the moment when the curse was cast on him, a miracle invoker, he had swapped places with his marionette. He opened his mouth once again and let out a roar. This roar also contained words that mostly resembled the source of Jotun, describing a beautiful wish: "I wish for all godhood here to dissipate." In the next second, as the god of wishes, the dark demonic wolf granted his wish. Klein immediately felt his godhood being repressed. The Beyonder powers that stemmed from Scholar of Yore and Bizarro Sorcerer could no longer be used. Fortunately, the historical projection was maintained with spirituality. As long as the summoning was successful, it wouldn't be dispelled by the dark demonic wolf's wish. Similarly, as Klein had already turned his historical projection into a marionette and transferred a number of worms of spirit over, he could still swap locations with his projection. Apart from him, Rionette Tineke and Dark Demonic Wolf were also affected by the wish that had been granted. Their Beyonder powers above Sequence 5 had vanished into thin air, making it difficult to use them. Of course, be it the demonic wolf marionette that had turned into a goat, or the gigantic doll like Rionette Tineke, there was no change in the form. What existed was reasonable, so it couldn't be eliminated by the power of wishes. After making this wish, the dark demonic wolf arched his back and bent his body slightly. It looked like he was about to engage in a battle with Klein and Rionette Tineke. At that moment, his mountain-like body was about the size of the castle-like doll. He looked down coldly at Klein, capable of crushing him with a single swipe of his claw. In addition, the castle had many marionettes rushing over. They consisted of giants, elves, vampires, humans, and deformed monsters. Only a number of them were at Sequence 5, but now, they had Katar's worms of spirit in their bodies. In other words, in this special environment, all of them were at Sequence 5. After the dissipation of godhood, in this independent kingdom, dark demonic wolf Katar's advantage became obvious. More than 100 Sequence 5s were besieging 2 Sequence 5s. Furthermore, the dark demonic wolf was itself a mutant. Even if he couldn't reveal any godhood, his massive size and terrifying strength made him adept at combat. He wasn't on the same level as a weak human-like marionettist Klein. At this moment, the body of Rionette Tineke, who was dressed in a black gothic dress that twined with sinister vines, suddenly turned incorporeal. First, she reflected on a floor-to-ceiling window, then it jumped into the pitch-black pupils of the dark demonic wolf. She had once again attempted Wraith's possession. However, dark demonic wolf Kotar swapped locations with another marionette in a timely fashion, preventing Rionette Tineke from successfully possessing his body. Rionette Tineke wasn't discouraged as she continued using mediums such as glass windows, chandeliers, and eyeballs to jump through the different marionettes in pursuit of the real dark demonic wolf. As for the dark demonic wolf, he relied on his numerous marionettes, and had the advantage of copious numbers of worms of spirit. He swapped between different marionettes without any pause to avoid being forcibly possessed by the ancient bane. Amidst the two angels' silent conflict, a large number of the dark demonic wolf's marionettes had surrounded the two Kleins. Beyonder powers like a vampire's, abyss shackles, a giant's, hurricane of light, an elf's, wind binding, and a human's, psychic piercing, and holy light summoning, inundated their targets. They controlled, weakened, attacked, and purified Klein, acting with great rapport. Klein was only able to dodge a portion of the attacks before being drowned by the attacks. Plasma exploded as the light blasted out. Klein's staff of the stars holding figure quickly outlined itself to the side. At that critical moment, he had exchanged spots with his marionette in time. He imagined his traveling powers and had used the staff of the stars to complete the teleportation. In this special scenario, this was essentially a release of recorded powers. After dodging this round of attacks, Klein discovered that a marionette was controlling his spirit body threads before he could catch his breath. At the same time, a human marionette reached out his right hand under the influence of the dark demonic wolf and aimed at the miracle invoker's actual body. In the next second, the dark demonic wolf and another marionette switched positions. As for the marionette, it was possessed by Rionette Tineke. This way, the human marionette's right hand was targeted at Rionette Tineke. The marionette's palm clenched tightly as his wrist spun half a circle, stealing away the target's subsequent thoughts. Right on the heels of that, he jumped and pounced on an ally. Rionette Tineke was momentarily rooted to the ground. When the dark demonic wolf saw this, he immediately got several marionettes to spread open their arms and summon pure pillars of cleansing flames to surround them. In the holy light, Wraith Rionette Tineke's body first began to melt. Following that, using mirror jump, she moved to a glass window situated high above the castle to avoid the subsequent purification. In just a few seconds, she and Klein inevitably fell into a perilous situation. The restricted environment, being on his home ground, and his trait as the god of wishes had magnified dark demonic wolf Kotar advantage to the extreme. If it were any other scholar of yore, there was only one problem he needed to consider: how to rely on Rionette Tineke to escape, but Klein had his trump card. Just as he pulled back his spirit body threads, he didn't hesitate to stir the powers of Sephira Castle. This trait of his wasn't suppressed by the dark demonic wolf's wish. This was something even the forsaken land of the gods couldn't screen. In mid-air, grayish-white fog appeared. The ancient palace above the spirit world appeared faint. Its appearance brought with it slight tremors. A certain power followed the connection and shook the demonic wolf's castle, causing the translucent black velvet curtain to jolt out of place a little, allowing the independent kingdom to intersect with reality. Seizing this opportunity, Klein opened his mouth and shouted out a name in Jotun, Leodero. Boom, boom, boom. Thousands of thick silver lightning bolts descended from the sky, smiting dark demonic wolf Qatar's castle. The area transformed into a lightning forest that emitted a strong destructive aura. Report chapter. Boom, boom, boom. The bolts of silver lightning that were as thick as an anaconda struck the translucent black velvet curtain. It shook violently as it distorted. Taking advantage of this opening, Rionette Tinika's figure, which was reflected on the castle's glass, jumped back into Klein's pocket and returned to the surface of the gold coin in the iron cigar case. The prepared Klein raised his right arm and calmly aimed the staff of the stars at the floor tiles in the hall. A scene surfaced in his mind. It represented one of the beyonder powers of a druid. The ground beneath his feet instantly softened, turning into a marsh. It made his body sink like it had fallen into a sea. Underground slink. Boom. The translucent black velvet curtain could no longer withstand the cleansing from the lightning storm the moment the marsh solidified. It curled into a ball and fell back into the castle. No longer restricted, the few thousand thick bolts of lightning rained down the ancient castle. A tower collapsed and the hall was left in shambles. One marionette after another burst into ephemeral illusions under the pricking of such a lightning strike. They were instantly charred black and reduced to ashes. When the silver light that illuminated the entire mountain range subsided, dark demonic wolf Qatar's castle was in ruins. Many spots were burning with red flames. Klein immediately emerged from the bottom of a deep pit and saw that the demonic wolf, covered in dark and short fur, had performed the same action. Relying on the three druids among his marionettes, he had successfully hidden underground to avoid the lightning bombardment. And at that moment, the independent kingdom, created by the curtain, had completely disintegrated. However, the dark demonic wolf's wish hadn't completely expired. The return of godhood still needed some time. Without any hesitation, both parties engaged in another intense battle. Kotar allowed the crinkled curtain to fly up and drape him, so as to prevent the wraith's possession. After all, there were only 3 of his marionettes left. Of course, this way, he could no longer swap locations with his marionettes. At the same time, Rionette Tinika left the gold coin in Klein's pocket and floated towards the 8-legged demonic wolf. She had given up on the idea of possession as her arms suddenly swelled. A few strands of gray hair grew from the back of her hand, and her nails became long, sharp, and firm. Werewolf transformation. This doll-like baneful entity became a huge werewolf. She kept moving at high speeds, waving her sharp claws as she engaged in an intense battle with the hill-like dark demonic wolf. Amidst the clashing sounds, Klein was attacked by Qatar's 3 remaining marionettes. One of them raised his head and roared, causing brown short hair to tear through his clothes. In an instant, he transformed into a terrifying giant bear that was twice the height of a person. One crouched down, pressing his palms against the ground, while the other raised his right hand and yanked his hair. At that moment, a crimson flame surged out of Klein's clothes, instantly devouring him. His figure appeared in a sea of flames to the side. Then, he jumped out, raised his staff, and charged straight at the huge brown bear. And at the spot where he was originally standing, dark green mutated vines pierced through the ground and grew wildly, stirring the remnant flames in the middle. Tap, tap, tap. The huge brown bear didn't back down. With heavy strides, it rushed towards Klein like a high-speed steam locomotive. It spread open its arms, trying to give him a passionate hug that could crush all his bones and squeeze all his chest muscles together. Tap, tap, tap. As his black trench coat flailed to his back, Klein didn't retreat. He was about to collide with the huge brown bear. Suddenly, he kicked his left foot and twisted his waist. He forcefully jumped up and flew past the brown bear diagonally. Thud. As the two crossed each other, Klein swung his black staff down and ruthlessly struck the brown bear's shoulder. Normally, such an attack wouldn't have been able to hurt the thick hide of the brown bear. However, with the Staff of the Stars, the physical attack would lead to random abnormal changes or strange effects. Of course, under the God of Wishes' suppression, these changes and effects wouldn't exceed that of a sequence 4 beyond a power. Thud. As the sound of the staff's strike reverberated, the huge brown bear's shoulder tore open diagonally from its shoulder. The bottom half of its torso teleported more than 10 meters away while the remaining portion remained in place. The brown bear's internal organs and blood gushed to the ground in a rather shocking scene. However, the brown bear wasn't dead yet. Its two halves were squirming as it struggled to stabilize his center of mass and continued attacking. As a marionette, he had long died. Such damage was nothing. At this moment, Klein had already jumped behind the brown bear, his feet stepping on the ground. Another wave of scarlet flames surged out, drowning his figure. A flame that was about to be extinguished rose up as Klein leaped out and arrived close to the marionette, which had both hands on the ground. With his silk top hat, he ran past the marionette without turning his head as he swung the staff to the side. Thud. The marionette's body burst into golden flames as his figure instantly vanished. A flame surged into the sky as the marionette jumped down. However, the golden flames didn't extinguish, quickly burning him to ashes. Without even looking over, Klein had already rushed in front of the marionette that was yanking his hair. The marionette immediately threw out the hair in his hand. These strands of hair began to burn as they emitted black gases, sounding alarms to Klein's spirituality senses. Poison. An unknown poison. With a creak, he forcefully stopped using his ability as a clown. Using the inertia of his body, he extended his black staff. All sorts of thoughts rapidly reformed in his mind, quickly forming a scene. Before this operation, Klein had requested Miss Justice's help to hypnotize him. It made his brain unable to form scenes when he subconsciously thought of one. There would only be a single thought resonating in his mind, and he had to take the initiative to control it to construct the scene. This allowed him to use the staff of the stars for a long time without being affected by the negative effects. As for the flaws of thinking in such a manner, Klein felt that it was still acceptable under predetermined conditions. Without a sound, the gems embedded in the staff of the stars lit up. A pure white and holy pillar of light descended from the sky, enveloping the black gas and the corresponding marionette. The poison quickly melted under the sun's burning. It was the same with the marionette. With a remnant glow still in his eyes, Klein instinctively turned around and aimed his staff at the brown bear that was split into two. Silver lightning flashed spontaneously before the separated brown bear's body finally collapsed, unable to get up again. In just a few seconds, Klein had finished off the remaining marionettes of the dark demonic wolf. After Sephira Castle's anomaly, be it him or the God of Wishes, time became abnormally precious. No one was willing to stall for time, because it wouldn't be long before high-level existences like the true creator and angel of time Amen in the forsaken land of the gods descended. Upon seeing this, dark demonic wolf Kotar trembled violently and flung out the translucent velvet curtain. The curtain first vanished into thin air before it suddenly appeared behind Klein. Just as his spirituality was about to send a warning, it covered him and wrapped him within it. Klein's vision immediately darkened as he felt his thoughts turn sluggish. His spirit body threads were being inoculated onto the curtain, one thread at a time. He attempted using flaming jump, softening his bones, and using the staff of the stars, but he was unable to succeed in such an abnormal state. The black velvet curtain became tighter and tighter, revealing the corresponding marks of his eyes, nose, and mouth, as though it was squeezing out a brand new person. Rionette Tinaka immediately jumped and appeared on the translucent curtain, purging it from Klein's body and teleporting elsewhere. The dark demonic wolf seized the opportunity and raised his neck, letting out a roar. The curtain stood up, as if it had become a cloak draped over an invisible person's body. A terrifying suction force was born, causing the spirit body threads of Rionette Tinaka and Klein to uncontrollably float over. If they didn't have the corresponding Beyonder powers, their spirit body threads would have merged into the cloak in just 3 to 4 seconds, while they would become its marionettes. Fortunately, Klein was a marionettist himself. He immediately focused his attention and controlled his and Miss Messenger's spirit body threads. He followed the method that he learned from Zaratul, allowing them to circle around him and return to their original positions, forming loops. Roar! The dark demonic wolf spat out a gas ball, sending it flying towards Klein like a cannonball. As he was focused on controlling his and Miss Messenger's spirit body threads, Klein could barely duck. Just as he was about to be struck, Rionette Tinaka floated over and stood in front of him. Boom! Rionette Tinika's blonde hair scattered as the evil vines wrapped around her body broke apart. The dark demonic wolf's follow-up actions were one smooth continuous series of actions. Taking advantage of the moment when the curtain was desperately pulling at its target's spirit body threads, he launched repeated attacks on Klein, forcing Rionette Tinika to block them. It caused the tough ancient Bane to tremble under the attack of his claws, air blobs, and flaming attacks. More and more wounds appeared, making it look like she could not last any longer. At this critical moment, as Klein controlled the spirit body threads to resist the attraction of the curtain, he reached into his pocket and took out another iron cigar case. The seal was removed and the box was opened. Inside, there was also a gold coin lying quietly. There was also a wraith on the surface of the gold coin. This was a blurry female wraith, a true undying creature, and not a wraith from the mutant pathway. It was the strongest trump card that Klein had prepared. Previously, because he was inside the isolated kingdom that wasn't connected to the outside world. He was afraid that he wouldn't be able to obtain the desired effect. Only when the curtain targeted him and Miss Messenger did he feel that the opportunity was here. As the box was opened, the wraith suddenly jumped onto the surface of a glass fragment. On it were nearly illusory black tubes that extended into infinity, connecting to the unknown. This was the symbol of artificial death. And artificial death was equivalent to the Evernite goddess. This trump card of his was the reenactment of the time when the Evernite goddess had used God of Glory Bladel's corpse to foil Amon's attempt to snatch Sephira Castle. For this, he deliberately found a wraith-like monster in the forsaken land of the gods and imprisoned it, placing it together with the artificial death project's white feathers he summoned from the fog of history. Through his repeated experiments and prayers during his specific trips to Backland, this wraith had finally established a certain connection with artificial death, allowing the Evernite goddess to use this opportunity to exert a rather low level of influence. The dark demonic wolf that was attacking Rionette Tinika seemed to sense something. He slowed down and turned to look at the wraith that had just appeared. His pupils, which already occupied 2/3 of his eyes, had suddenly dilated, as if he caught scent of a familiar but dangerous aura. In the blink of an eye, the wraith raised her arms. The power of wishes in the surrounding area rapidly diminished at an accelerated rate. Godhood began to return, having reached the level of Sequence 4. Under the soil beneath the dark demonic wolf's feet, pale white and illusory arms emerged. They were densely packed like a forest, grabbing onto Qatar's 8 legs, making this miracle invoker feel like he had fallen into a cold and dead silence. He was temporarily unable to break free. Using this opportunity, Rionette Tinika, who had turned sluggish due to her controlled spirit body threads, turned illusory as she vanished. In the pitch-black pupils of the dark demonic wolf, the blonde Miss Messenger in a dark and complicated long dress that was wrapped with vines suddenly phased into existence and completed the possession process. The actions of the god of wishes instantly stiffened, as if he had degraded from a living creature to a marionette. He attempted to influence Rionette Tinika's spirit body threads, so as to resist the wraith's possession. However, from time to time, he would be interrupted by the pale white arms created by the female wraith. Success eluded him. Klein maintained the looping of their spirit body threads as he slowly raised the Staff of the Stars, aiming it at the black velvet curtain that had turned into a cloak. He then constructed a scene in his mind. The surrounding darkness suddenly flowed, as if it contained an unimaginable secret. Bit by bit, illusory candles lit up in such an environment, illuminating a long table laid out with flesh and blood. On the 2 sides of the long table, 3 extremely blurry figures were holding up the flesh and blood, ravenously devouring them. In the next second, the 3 figures turned their heads simultaneously and cast their gazes at the translucent black velvet curtain. The crazy suction force emitted by the curtain came to an abrupt halt as it hovered in its original spot. It was as if it had momentarily forgotten who it was, whose side it was on, and what it should do. Feast of Betrayal. Fairy Tale Magic's Feast of Betrayal. The fairy tale magic that Klein had just used was the Feast of Betrayal, that originated from the hermit Katlia. Its effect was to temporarily awaken the items in the target's hands or imbue them with intelligence, allowing them to carry out betrayals. This was a Sequence 4 beyond a power, so it couldn't be used under the restrictions of the Power of Wishes. At the same time, as the Staff of the Stars' emulated spell was lacking compared to the original spell, as well as the fact that it didn't harbor any ill intentions towards the dark demonic wolf, it only appeared lost and didn't fervently attack its master. And the moment Klein extricated himself from the influence of the curtain, he immediately snapped his fingers, letting the scarlet flames drown him. In an instant, he appeared in a flame beside the dark demonic wolf wearing a half-top hat and a long black trench coat. The scarlet flame soared up, transforming into a blazing flame that allowed him to easily leap out. He arched his back slightly and raised the staff of stars as he dashed towards the towering demonic wolf. Tap, tap, tap. Klein ran faster and faster, as though transforming into a strong gust of wind. What welcomed him was the dark demonic wolf that barely managed to lift up his front two claws that had broken free of the restraints. Pa, pa. Klein waved his black staff to his left and right, accurately hitting the two front claws of Kotar, making them pause momentarily. At the same time, he crouched down and slid under the dark demonic wolf's two front claws. Amidst the howling winds, Klein turned around in midair and thrust upwards with the staff of the stars. With a puff, the gem-embedded black staff pierced through the dark and short-furred skin, driving deeply into the dark demonic wolf's body. A ludicrous gash tore open. Whoosh! Deep black blood with hints of red gushed out like a flood, spraying a substance with strong corrosive properties that belonged to a mythical creature at Klein. But at that moment, Klein's momentum had brought him flying under the dark demonic wolf. He was preparing to launch his second round of attacks. Suddenly, he heard an intermittent roar. This was from Wraith's possession. Due to the difficulty in moving, what dark demonic wolf Kotar meant was, Leo, de, ro. Klein's gaze froze as the dark demonic wolf's mocking smile appeared in his mind. He wasn't the only one who could stir the remaining divine powers. He could do so, but so could dark demonic wolf Kotar. Even though this miracle invoker didn't know that Wind Angel, Leodero, had already become the Lord of Storms, he naturally knew what to do thanks to Klein's demonstration from before. Who wouldn't know how to do a simple imitation? Boom, boom, boom. Silvery white bolts of lightning smote down like gushing water from a water pipe. They rained over the ruins of the ancient castle, completely drowning all the figures. Klein didn't manage to react in time. After hearing the first half of the word, he had already used the powers of Clown to forcefully twist his body around. With a stomp of his right foot, he returned under the dark demonic wolf's body. As for Rionette Tinnicker, she had jumped onto the gold coin in his pocket. Immediately following that, Klein genuflected and inserted the staff of the stars into the ground. Boom, boom, boom. The vast storm tore through everything in its way. By the time the terrifying lightning forest dissipated, the ancient castle that belonged to the dark demonic wolf couldn't even be considered a ruin. There were no traces of it at all, leaving only a charred crater. Within the deep pit, paper figurines were blown up as they were reduced to ashes. Without a sound, a piece of soil that shimmered with the glint of rainbow-colored glass softened. Klein's burnt hand reached out. With the dark demonic wolf suffering the brunt of the damage, he had used paper figurine substitutes and underground slink to barely survive. He could faintly smell the aroma of roasted meat exuding from his body. After returning to the ground, the tattered clothed Klein turned his gaze and took in the battlefield's situation. The remnants of the dark demonic wolf's corpse were scattered everywhere. Its flesh was charred and lifeless. The curtain was curled into a ball, having fallen to the edge of the deep crater, motionless. The power of wishes had been completely wiped out, and godhood had returned to this region. The wraith that had a connection with artificial death had been destroyed. If it were any other Beyonder, they would probably think that the dark demonic wolf had chosen an outcome of mutual destruction, but as a demigod of the seer pathway, and having enjoyed the benefits of a miracle invoker ahead of time, something else flashed across Klein's mind. What is a miracle? A miracle is to be resurrected from the dead. When the dark demonic wolf saw that the situation wasn't right, he didn't hesitate to summon divine punishment in an attempt to kill everyone. Then, he could revive somewhere nearby. I almost used up my last revival. With regards to such matters, Klein had a certain contingency plan. He immediately used a charm engraved with the Fool's patterns, and used it as a proxy for praying to Mr. Fool in front of Miss Messenger. Then, he used the summoning of Sephira Castle that had yet to disappear to enter the world above the grey fog with a thought. He then relied on the prayer lights, true vision, to inspect the surroundings to seek out the resurrected dark demonic wolf. At this moment, Rionette Tinnicker left the gold coin in Klein's pocket and appeared beside the curtain that was curled into a ball. Her voice was slightly ethereal as she said, "It has a miracle invoker beyond a characteristic." A miracle invoker's beyond a characteristic. That's right. The Dark Demonic Wolf possesses one of the 6 Miss Miracle Invoker characteristics under the premise that all the attendants of mysteries are accounted for. Under normal circumstances, the remaining attendant of mysteries beyond a characteristic also has one set of Miracle Invoker beyond a characteristic. As Miss Messenger spoke, Klein's spiritual intuition also sensed it. After confirming her judgment, he connected it to Will Orsepton's answer. There should be a total of 9 Miracle Invoker beyond a characteristics, but under the premise that the attendant of mysteries are all filled, the 3 sequence 1s would definitely each occupy one sequence 2 characteristic. The remaining 6 Miracle Invoker characteristics belong to Zaratul, Antigonus, the Magic Wishing Lamp, Theater with Curtains That Never Draw, The Last Banquet, and the Dark Demonic Wolf respectively. He had originally hoped to obtain the Dark Demonic Wolf's characteristic, but he hadn't expected that the curtain not only had a Sequence 1 Attendant of Mysteries characteristic but also a Sequence 2 Miracle Invoker characteristic. It was also the one that had disappeared. It looks like the reason for its disappearance was also because of the grey fog. Later on, it was spat out. Do I still seek out the resurrected Dark Demonic Wolf? No, I don't know when the true Creator and Amen will descend. Furthermore, I've already exhausted most of my preparations. The Dark Demonic Wolf is still in perfect condition. He can make a wish, summon, and create miracles. After all, my goal has already been met. As his thoughts raced, Klein looked up and said to Miss Messenger, "I'll put this curtain away." He gave up the thought of chasing after the Dark Demonic Wolf and decided to control the curtain while it was still weak. Rionette Tinnicker nodded slightly and turned her head, casting her gaze at the charred remains of the Dark Demonic Wolf. The remains immediately emitted a faint glow, either turning into white rabbits or transforming into goats. They were the kind that smelled rich and flavorful. In a hidden area nearby, the dark, short-furred Dark Demonic Wolf quickly took shape. He gave up on his original corpse and immediately made a wish and granted it. He teleported to a distant spot and then ran off without looking back. This god of wishes didn't even consider the loss of the curtain. He didn't choose to revive where he died, because he hoped to use the curtain to stall the fellow who was closely related to Evernite. This gave him plenty of time to escape. Since he could survive from the Second Epoch until now, he had followed his true feelings, cowardice. He refused to be greedy when the situation didn't allow for it. With a flash, the demonic wolf with a grey tuft of hair on his forehead disappeared into the darkness. Klein didn't stop Miss Messenger from venting her anger. As he approached the curtain, he sighed inwardly, an angel is really hard to kill. It's especially so for the seer pathway. As this thought flashed through his mind, and just as he was about to drag his past self out to pick up the curtain, he suddenly felt a familiar aura descend. This aura was dark, foul, and full of degeneration. It immediately made him think of the true Creator. The curtain suddenly floated up and turned into a cloak. Inside the cloak, the darkness turned into a whirlpool as it hummed, "Mysteries. Mysteries." Klein's heart palpitated when he heard that. He subconsciously wanted to return to Sephira Castle and leave the scene. However, no matter how much he tried, his spirit body remained inside his body without any changes. Man! This vexed Klein. He instinctively cast his gaze towards Rionette Tinnicker who was beside him. He saw that Miss Messenger had already floated over, looking like she was facing a terrifying enemy. And the surrounding darkness froze like a cold lake. Lightning stopped streaking across the sky. Mysteries. Klein felt a slight sense of security as he thought back to the title he had just heard. He was no stranger to that. However, the last person who addressed him in this manner was the ancient sun god, the City of Silver's creator, from 2,000 years ago. Before he died, he sensed Klein's divination and shouted this out through an insurmountable distance of space and time. No way. The true Creator is equivalent to the ancient sun god. No, he is only a sequence 0 true god, far from the level of the Creator that I assumed. Furthermore, from Amen's attitude, the ancient sun god must have really perished. The true Creator is the pitch-black infant that emerged from the ancient sun god's stomach and inherited some of the ancient sun god's characteristics and memories. He is the degenerated body of that Creator. Klein composed himself and attempted to rapidly think of a solution to his present conundrum. At this moment, in the cloak formed by the curtain, the dark whirlpool made another sound, "Go to the giant king's court and meet Sasria." This sentence directly reverberated in Klein's mind. Then, in the form of an illusory word, it shrunk into a pitch-black membrane, forming a strange seed. The seed immediately fell into his body and spirit body, melting inside. Without waiting for a response, the dark whirlpool dissipated. The cloak formed by the curtain lost its support and fell back onto the ground. The true Creator's consciousness that descended had corroded a portion of my spirit body and some of my physical body. I'm compelled to go to the giant king's court and open the slumbering dark angel Sasria's palace. This is a matter that many deities are paying attention to. After watching for a long time, the true Creator has finally found an opportunity to force me to do it. Klein looked around and summoned his past self, picking up the curtain. Then, he said to Miss Messenger without hesitation, "Let's leave immediately." The true Creator had already sent a sliver of his will over. Would Aemon still be far away? In addition, Klein also tried to seize the opportunity to enter the world above the grey fog, hoping to use the power of Sephira Castle to remove the corrosive influences that plagued him. All right. Rionette Tineke nodded, allowing the numerous Beyonder characteristics left behind in the crater to fly over and be contained within her. According to their prior agreement, other than the spoils of war that involved the high sequences of the Seer pathway, half of them would go to her, with her having the priority to choose. After all, Klein had also received some of the spoils back when dealing with Shaman King Klarman. As for the remaining half of the spoils, Klein planned on offering it to the Evernite goddess as a form of gratitude. Regardless of whether the deity needed it or not, he still needed to do the necessary procedures. He had to express his gratitude when needed. After clearing the battlefield, Rionette Tineke entered the iron cigar case in Klein's pocket and, possessed, the gold coin's surface. Klein didn't immediately seal her. Holding the Staff of the Stars, he conjured a scene in his mind. That was one of the scenes he had memorized during his inspection of the terrain. As the gems flashed, his figure disappeared from the crater as he teleported far away. A few seconds later, the air there fluctuated as a tiny creature that was difficult to see with the naked eye crawled out. The creature rapidly expanded, turning into Aemon, who wore a pointed hat and classic black robe. The corners of Aemon's mouth curled up as he adjusted the monocle on his right eye and chuckled. Someone is finally opening that door. Ellipsis. After 2 rounds of teleportation, Klein took out the iron cigar case that Miss Messenger was hiding in, and used the Staff of the Stars to create several layers of seals, the kind that would be removed the moment he touched it. Right on the heels of that, he entered the fog of history and dashed all the way to a time before the First Epoch. He relied on the prayers he had yet to reply to and instantly entered the world above the grey fog through the summoning of Sephira Castle. As the roars and the ravings echoed, he felt the corrosion in his spirit body gather together, curling into a ball. Despite passing through layers of cleansing effects, it managed to maintain its stability and didn't completely evaporate. Is this the power and level of a true deity? Yes, and it's a true deity who wields the domain of degeneration. Sitting in the seat belonging to the fool, Klein frowned slightly as he observed his state. The corrosion created by the true Creator wasn't strong. If they were to leave the protection of Klein's spirit body, they wouldn't be able to last long above the grey fog. This was also the main reason why he had made the judgment and dared to directly enter Sephira Castle. However, unless he planned on dying again, there was no way he could bypass his own spirit body to remove the corrosion. With the help of divination and other abilities, Klein quickly figured out the various effects of the corrosion. It wouldn't mutate, send a message to the true Creator, or interfere with what he did. It would only continue to steer him via mystic means towards the giant king's court. It compelled Klein to open the palace where Dark Angel Sasria was in deep sleep. It's partly in the mind, and also at the level of fate. When I become a miracle invoker and become an angel, deepening my control of Sephira Castle, I should be able to clear this corruption. However, if I want to become a miracle invoker and become an angel, I have to go to the giant king's court and open the door to that palace, helping the City of Silver find a way to leave the forsaken land of the gods. As Klein thought, he revealed a wry smile. Fortunately, this was something he was prepared to do, and it didn't burden him further. Following that, Klein summoned the unshadowed crucifix from the fog of history, attempting to use the power of Sephira Castle to drive it into purifying his body. Unfortunately, part of his body was also merged together with the corrosion, preventing him from completely cleansing it. This also made him truly understand how terrifying Sequence Zero was. I can't just pray to an evil god like the true Creator unless I'm in a hopeless situation. Klein shook his head and returned to the real world before sacrificing the curtain above the grey fog. It does indeed contain the Beyonder characteristic of an attendant of mysteries, as well as a miracle invoker's Beyonder characteristic. There's even Scholar of Yore and Bizarro sorcerer characteristics. It has a rather high level. The power I can use from Sephira Castle at present isn't able to directly shatter it. However, this place seems to be at the highest level of the seer pathway, so it can effectively suppress it. Through the accumulation of time, I should be able to slowly separate it. The first to be separated should be the Attendant of Mysteries characteristic. The rest can be used to concoct a potion directly. It doesn't have any living characteristics. The one that was summoned just now has already disappeared. With the translucent black velvet curtain in hand, he looked at it for a while. Then, he activated Sephira Castle and conjured a metal pot which was boiling with invisible power. After staring at it for a few seconds, he threw the curtain into the metal pot, and pressed down with layers of seals onto the pot's lid. In about 3 to 4 days, the Attendant of Mysteries Beyonder characteristic would separate. The supplementary ingredients could be thrown into what remained, and it would then be a miracle invoker potion, one that included the characteristics from sequence 9 to 2. Looking around, he raised his right hand and took a piece of paper from the junk pile. This was one of his other preparations. He had spent a large amount of time in advance and had failed time and time again to successfully summon 008. Using this quill, he wrote down what reasonable reactions Dark Demonic Wolf would have. This was to prevent the other party from reacting in unexpected ways from the very beginning, causing his plans to fail. With the cooperation of this short script, the Dark Demonic Wolf had been attracted by Klein's strange behavior. Therefore, it was very reasonable that he didn't extinguish the prayer light immediately. Similarly, without knowing how many enemies or what strength the other party had, the Dark Demonic Wolf didn't flee in a hurry. Instead, he created a complete independent kingdom, isolating it from any possible reinforcements. It was a very reasonable reaction. With a flick of his wrist, Klein burned the piece of paper, then he hurriedly sacrificed the sealed iron cigar case to Sephira Castle. He then responded to Miss Magician's prayer and relayed the world's message. Foles didn't dare to delay any further. She immediately got up and used her recording Beyonder powers to grab at the area ahead, dragging out Gehrman Sparrow from history. With that, Klein teleported to the empty room in a nearby hotel. He set up a ritual and brought the iron cigar case back to reality, releasing Rionette Tinnicker. After thanking Miss Messenger and watching her take away half of the Beyonder characteristics, he changed the ritual and began to perform a sacrifice to the Evernite goddess. At the end of the ritual, he prayed with anticipation, "I pray for a hint on how to purify the corrosive influences in my body." In his opinion, at present, only an existence at the level of the Evernite goddess could deal with the corrosion provided by the true creator. If the goddess agreed to it, Klein planned to descend in a way that would allow his actual spirit to return to Backland and receive purification. As for removing the part of his body that had been corroded, he hadn't thought of a solution yet. As he said that, a ball of darkness enveloped the altar. When the darkness vanished, all the Beyonder characteristics disappeared. Apart from that, there were no other hints. It looks like I can only rely on myself. Klein wasn't depressed. He raised his right hand and tapped his chest 4 times, drawing the crimson moon. Praise the lady. His gratitude was very sincere. After all, he had received a lot of help. After dealing with the subsequent matters, his historical projection vanished and he returned to the forsaken land of the gods in person. He held the lantern he had pulled out from the past, and he looked at the silent and desolate plains under the dim yellow light. He felt much more relaxed and couldn't help but sigh. Finally, in the primitive forest outside Byam City of the Rorstad archipelago, the leaders of the resistance gathered in a mountain cave as they looked respectfully at the sea god's blessed. He was wearing a black cloak, his brows were yellow, and his blue eyes were dark blue. "Lord Danitz, this is an opportunity," a bald man in a wheelchair with a green beard, Kalat, said in excitement. His partner, Edmonton, whose face was colored with short red patterns, immediately said, "Lord Danitz, according to our intelligence officers, the situation in Byam is chaotic. Be it the Church of the Lord of Storms or the Governor-General's office, everyone is feeling anxious because of the encirclement of Backland by the Fazak military forces." Having said that, Edmonton looked at Kalat and got the person in charge of the corresponding field to give a more detailed description. Kalat looked at the solemn-looking Lord Danitz and deliberated over his words. Internal cracks amongst them can already be seen. Some people wished to commandeer the forces of the colonies to support Backland, while others wished to hold on to this place as the tinder for their resurgence. This difference in opinion has caused the military and the beyonders of the Church of the Lord of Storms to be at a loss. There are flaws in every aspect. Lord Danitz, this is our chance. We can agree to the conditions of Fezak and the Finapota Navy. We can cooperate with them to attack Byam and take back our kingdom. It's indeed an opportunity, but is this something I can decide? It's not like I'm stupid. Danitz listened quietly to the leaders of the resistance and muttered to himself. Having grown up in Intis, this famous pirate, treasure hunter didn't have any qualms about attacking the Loan colonies. He had zero hesitation or uncertainty about it. Of course, he didn't have a strong sense of belonging to the Intis Republic either. In fact, when he was occasionally a part-time pirate, he preferred targeting businessmen from Intis. This was because they often carried more valuable luxury items with them. There was only one reason why Danitz didn't agree on the spot to the request of the resistance's leaders. It was because he had become a conspirer, so he knew very well what his position was. A human mouthpiece. A tool that was responsible for passing messages between Gehrman Sparrow and the leaders of the resistance. Gehrman is most likely Loanese. If I were to agree to it directly, I might not be able to see tomorrow's sun. However, he acts like he doesn't care about Loan at all. Doggish tea. I can't be fooled by such superficial appearances. Danitz cleared his throat and surveyed the area. This matter is of grave importance. Prepare a clean and serene altar immediately. I need to pray to God. In an organization that believed in the sea god, such a request didn't surprise the likes of Kalat, Edmonton, and the others. It even met their expectations. Hence, they immediately arranged for people to prepare for the sacrifice. Ellipsis. The resistance in the Rorstad archipelago can't sit still any longer. They were also supported by countries like Fezak, Intis, and Finapota to survive this long, or else they would have been annihilated by Loan and the three churches. I even got them to extract quite a bit of help from the various countries. After hearing Danitz's prayers, he sighed. Sitting in the ancient palace, he lightly tapped the edge of the mottled table in front of him. After pondering for a few seconds, he conjured the world Gehrman Sparrow. The crazy adventurer immediately took on a praying posture and said in a deep voice, use the current situation to directly negotiate with the upper echelons of the Church of Storms and the Governor-General's office. Exert pressure on them. The goal is to force them to give in and accept the idea of self-governance by the people of the Rorstad archipelago. The resistance can guarantee that the Loanese will have most of their interests protected, allowing them to mobilize the troops and beyonders to reinforce Backland. Inside the clean and tidy altar, Danitz, who received the feedback, straightened his back. He turned around and looked at the leaders waiting outside. He said with a solemn expression, I have received a revelation. God has informed us that every citizen of his is precious. Unnecessary sacrifices for the sake of war should be avoided. We absolutely wouldn't want to start a war, but we are not afraid of having one. In short, let's try to use the present situation to negotiate with Loan with our forces, forcing them to make a concession that will satisfy most of us. If not, we can consider war. God says to remember the hatred, but don't let it blind your rationality. The people around you and a beautiful future are the most important things. After becoming a conspirer, Danitz realized that his powers of persuasion and his ability to fabricate explanations were increasing by leaps and bounds. Many a time, his thoughts would automatically take shape when he opened his mouth. Kalat, Edmonton, and the other leaders of the resistance all had a deep hatred for the Loan colonial masters, but the words of the sea god and Lord Danitz had successfully wavered their resolve. They had a clear understanding of how powerful the Sea King was over this period of time. If the war developed to the point where both parties were blinded with bloodlust, the Blue Mountain Island where Byam was located might be completely submerged by the sea and become a ruin. All the locals would end up being dragged to the grave by their actions. The powerhouses from Fezak and Finapota were indeed capable of stopping the situation from collapsing. However, how much power could they divert to this peripheral battlefield in the Rorstad archipelago? As for them, Kalat and the other leaders of the resistance didn't trust them much. They believed that these fellows were no different from the Loanese. They were all bandits from the northern continent and could rip off their masks at any time to become the new colonial masters. After a moment of silence, Kalat, who was sitting in a wheelchair, looked at the man in a black cloak on the altar and said, Lord Danitz, we are willing to work hard for peace. He paused for a moment before saying, according to the intel, the one who has the final say in the Rorstad archipelago is Sea King Jan Kottmann. It's best if we negotiate with him directly. Danitz nodded slightly and said, that's exactly what I was thinking. We need to send someone to represent us and enter Byam to face Jan Kottmann. Just as he was about to ask who was willing to go, he suddenly noticed that the gazes of Kalat, Edmonton, and the others were all on his face. It was as though they were saying that the Blessed of Sea God, the Intis pirate who had a relatively extraordinary status, was the most suitable candidate. Doggish tea. Danitz cursed silently as he looked at the crowd and quickly thought of something. Yes, this is an honor, and it also contains extreme danger. I know that some of you are filled with the spirit of sacrifice and want to make the necessary contributions. How about this? Let's draw lots to decide. This is the fairest way. I have no objections. Kalat and company didn't hesitate to give an answer. A few minutes later, Danitz looked at the card in his hand as his facial muscles twitched. City of Silver, at the top of the spire, in the chief's room. Colin Iliad cast his gaze at Derek Berg, who appeared less physically developed when placed in contrast to his surroundings. Are you ready? With the leg bone-like object in his hand, Derek held the ghostly blue thunder god's roar, which was wrapped in lightning bolts, and nodded heavily. Ready and good to go. He didn't act like a Beyonder from the Sun Domain, but more like a berserk warrior. With white hair and an old scar on his face, Colin Iliad immediately shifted his gaze and looked at Lovia. Are you ready? Lovia, who had a head of silvery grey hair and a pair of light grey eyes, no longer wore the usual black robe with purple stripes. Instead, she wore a set of black armor. She nodded her head indiscernibly and said, ready. Demon Hunter Colin, who had become a Silver Knight, cast his gaze on the others in the room and asked if they were ready. After receiving a positive response, Colin Iliad slowly walked to a wall, removed the two swords hanging on it, and carried them behind him. Let's set off. The City of Silver chief gave the order in a concise manner. The team that he led would once again head to the afternoon town camp. They would explore the Giant King's court further, and find a path to the real sea. Amidst the clinking sounds of metal, Lovia, Derek, and company silently followed behind the chief. They walked out of the room and down the stairs in an orderly manner. Along the way, they saw Waite Chermont and the other elders of the six-member council. They saw the City of Silver residents maintaining order in the spire. These people were either leaning on a railing or waiting at the staircase. Their expressions were abnormally solemn, as though they were sending off the team that was carrying hope. No one spoke. The entire place was silent, but when Colin Iliad and the others passed by, the City of Silver residents raised their right arm and clenched their fists. Amidst the sound of this action, Colin and the other members of the expedition team left the spire and hit the road. They immediately lit lanterns covered in animal hide. Under the dim yellow light, residents of the City of Silver walked out of their houses and stopped by the roadside. They looked at Derek and company with admiration and anticipation. One by one, they raised their right arm and clenched their fists in front of their foreheads. Derek subconsciously straightened his back, his heart burning. Just like that, the expedition team followed the path to the city gate under the watchful gazes of the crowd and walked out of the City of Silver. As though they had a tacit understanding, Colin, Derek, and Lovia, who had just left the protection of the city walls, turned their heads at the same time to look at their home, which had stood in the darkness for 2,584 years. They saw that the residents of the City of Silver hadn't left. They were all standing near the city gates, looking at them. With a swoosh, everyone raised their right arm and placed their fists in front of their foreheads. This was the highest form of respect and also the deepest heartfelt blessing they could give. Colin Iliad stared silently for a few seconds, then he closed his eyes and raised his right arm, waving it downwards. Set off. Derek and company immediately turned around and carried the animal hide lanterns which emitted a faint yellow light. They stepped onto the dark path in silence and determination. Destination, Giant King's Court. Boom, boom. In an underground shelter in Backland, Audrey, who was dressed in hunting attire, listened to the distant explosions. When she turned around, she happened to see Melissa looking at her in confusion. The young girl, who had just reached adulthood, asked in a dreamy tone, Miss Audrey, will the war end if we're completely defeated? Will we no longer have to worry about bombardments, raids, and having insufficient food? Audrey looked at her deeply and said, but if that happens, you will have to change your faith. Melissa hesitated, not knowing how to respond. At this moment, a commoner curled up against the wall blurted out, I believe in the god of steam and machinery. Even if Fezak and Intis win, I don't need to change my faith. When that happens, life would return to its original warm and peaceful state. These words stirred the commoners who were hiding in the shelter. They whispered to each other and discussed possible developments. There were no lack of Evernite believers. To most people, faith wasn't that important compared to life. After all, a true deity would eventually still protect them. The police officers who maintained the order of the shelter didn't stop the commotion from spreading. They watched on coldly, some even having a hint of anticipation. However, the defeated will definitely suffer something far crueler than you can imagine. It's not something that can be summarized with just a change of faith. Be it a lesson from history or her conclusion deduced from the human psyche, all of them made Audrey more pessimistic than everyone present. She looked around and could not help but sigh inwardly. The goddess's anchor is already greatly shaken. If not for the grain support from before, it might have completely collapsed. As for what this situation meant, Audrey knew very well in her heart. She closed her eyes, tilted her head slightly, and muttered to herself silently, "The battle of gods is about to begin." The final outcome was about to appear. After nodding at Melissa, Audrey turned and left the area, arriving at the entrance of the shelter. The golden retriever, Susie, was seated there, looking like a qualified guard. "You don't seem like you plan to return." Susie's nose twitched as she asked with a suppressed voice. Audrey had hidden herself in this shelter from the beginning of the siege that began today, therefore, she hadn't had the time to return to her own residence in Empress Borough. As the battle had decreased in intensity slightly, Earl Hall had already sent 2 people to urge her to return, so that she could head for a sanctuary for nobles. Audrey shook her head and said with a faint smile, "I have to do what I need to do." Without waiting for Susie's reply, she smiled and said, "Stay here on my behalf and secretly placate them. Don't let any commotions happen here. If they want to pat you, let them do so." Susie hesitated for 2 seconds before saying, "All right." Audrey didn't say anything else. She left the shelter, completely ignored by the troop of soldiers guarding the shelter. The sky outside was dark, and there were many buildings that had collapsed. They burned with flames that were about to be extinguished. The streets were empty, with no carriages or pedestrians. This was completely different from what Audrey remembered of Backland. Backland was originally blue, yellow, and beige. It was lively, bustling, and full of vitality. But now, it was gray, black, and scarlet. It was in shambles, disorder, and somewhat silent. Looking left and right, Audrey identified her bearings while in her hunting attire, and walked towards the city borders. What she wanted to do was simple: join the war and do her best to help Lowen not collapse before the end of the Battle of Gods. If the winner of the Battle of Gods was the opposing side, she would use various methods, such as hypnosis, mental plague, and other means, to prevent the soldiers, officers, and beyonders from venting their emotions, as well as reduce the damage brought by the war. Amidst the flickering flames, Audrey quickly passed through them and ran into the distance. Rorstad Archipelago, City of Generosity, Byam. In a room at the top of the Cathedral of Waves. Dressed in a black cloak, Danitz met the legendary Cardinal of the Church of Storms, the high-ranking deacon of the Mandated Punishers, Sea King Jan Kopman. Glancing at the muscles that filled up his priest robes, Danitz swallowed the words he was about to say, and he deliberated for a moment before saying, "I come with good intentions." For some reason, he felt that his skin was numb, as though invisible lightning was dancing on them. Good intentions. The tall, muscular, well-defined Jan Kopman grunted. "Hey, I had already considered the fact that fellows from the sailor pathway are more irritable, making them incapable of telling the difference between a joke and sarcasm. Once their anger erupts, they don't even consider the overall situation. Otherwise, I wouldn't even need to speak like this." Doggish tea. Danitz mumbled to himself, maintaining his smile as he explained the resistance's intentions. Jan Kopman stared at the pirate whose affiliation with the Golden Dream remained unknown and suddenly sneered. "If we withdraw most of our strength, can you defend Byam and the archipelago? If you can't defend it, how are you going to guarantee that the interests of the Lowen migrants will be maintained when the Fezak and Finapotter combined navy forces breach the defense lines?" As a demigod, he was extremely certain that sea god Carvatur had already perished. However, he didn't know who it was that was using the name of sea god, or if that entity had the ability to protect the Rorstad archipelago. That's a good question. Only with questions can there be room for a successful negotiation. In fact, Danitz had never thought of how the resistance would defend against the Fezak and Finapotter after Lowen's powerhouses were transferred back to Backland. He fully believed that Gairman Sparrow and Mr. Fool behind him had the ability to protect this place. As his thoughts raced, Danitz looked at the extremely oppressive Sea King and said, "I will pray to my lord and ask him to protect the Rorstad archipelago." Oh. Sea King Jan Kottmann narrowed his eyes and took a step forward. The aura from the Tyrant pathway made Danitz involuntarily take 2 steps back. He lowered his head and prayed on the spot. "Blessed of the sea and spirit world, guardian of the Rorstad archipelago, ruler of the undersea creatures, master of tsunamis and storms, the great Carvatur, please send down your powers to protect the Rorstad archipelago." After the prayer, Danitz carefully cast his gaze out the window, but he didn't discover anything unusual. Jan Kottmann sized him up for a few seconds before saying, "Your god doesn't seem to be responding." Ahem. Danitz cleared his throat and felt his heart beating like a drum. At that moment, the sky outside suddenly darkened. It was as if a large number of dark clouds were flying over, blotting out the sun. Sea King Jan Kottmann instinctively turned his head and looked out the window. He saw a shadow cast over the border between the sea and the sky. With his control of the archipelago's waters, scenes of the overall situation rapidly surfaced in the Cardinal's mind. The Rorstad archipelago, along with the surrounding seas, was shrouded by thick fog. It became indistinct and surreal. A seabird flew past and attempted to land on the dock, but it failed to pass through it, unable to set foot. The commoners in the archipelago continued living normally, aside from noticing the brewing storm. This, Jan Kottmann's dark blue pupils dilated significantly. He subconsciously turned his head to look at the sea god's blazing Danitz. Danitz's mouth gaped slightly as he forgot to close it. His shock was not lesser than the shock Sea King experienced. A few seconds later, the fog dissipated and the shadows faded away. Everything in the Rorstad archipelago returned to normal. Danitz blinked. When Sea King Jan Kottmann looked over again, Danitz chuckled and said, "My lord has responded to my prayers." As he spoke, the pirate with a bounty of more than £10,000 slapped himself inwardly. "Doggish tea. You actually dare to suspect Mr. Fool. Isn't this the might of Mr. Fool?" Jan Kottmann remained silent for a few seconds before saying, "I will consider your proposal carefully. I will immediately convene a meeting with the key figures in Byam to discuss this matter. I will give you an answer in an hour." Danitz lifted his chin slightly and laughed. "I will wait patiently." With that said, he followed his instincts as a hunter, and he indifferently bowed before leaving the room. Amidst the creaking sound, silver bolts of lightning lit up in the blue eyes of Jan Kottmann. In the ancient palace above the fog, Klein threw the curtain back into the metal pot and sealed it again. He had used the power of a Sequence 1 attendant of mysteries and stirred the power of Sephira Castle to respond, creating a shocking effect for Jan Kottmann. In another half a day, the attendant of mysteries beyond a characteristic will be separated, and the rest can be used to concoct the miracle invoker potion. Yes, when it's only at the Sequence 2 level, I can attempt to use the power Sephira Castle to shatter it and let the beyonder characteristics such as the Scholar of Yore and Bizarro Sorcerer to seep out in a shorter amount of time. That will lower the risk brought by the potion. Klein mumbled before rapidly returning to the real world. He wasn't situated in the dark moors anymore, but the frozen dusk of the Giant King's Court. He had entered the Giant King's Court before the City of Silver's expedition team arrived at the afternoon town encampment. Under the orange light, Klein felt the degeneration and exhaustion of his body. He cast his gaze at the magnificent and beautiful buildings situated high above. The countless palaces and towers still had the remnant glory of the Second Epoch, as though they were a manifestation of myths. No, it was a myth. Before the City of Silver's exploration team officially took action, Klein planned on attempting to open the palace where Dark Angel Sasria was sleeping. This way, if there were any accidents, the City of Silver's expedition team would still have time to make targeted preparations. As for Klein himself, it would definitely be much safer for him compared to the others since he was using a historical projection. Report chapter. As he had the information from the City of Silver's previous explorations, Klein knew which places were dangerous and how to avoid them. It didn't take long for him to follow the small path, pass through the waning forest, barren tunnel, and use the ancient elevator to arrive at the residence of the guards. After waiting for a while, until the curtain above the grey fog split into two, separating the attendant of mysteries beyond a characteristic, Klein reached out to pull his past self out. He didn't know if the other divine kingdoms would isolate the fog of history, but at least without the Giant King's Court having its owner present, no one would be able to stop his attempts. Unfortunately, this matter involves too many levels. I can't obtain any results from divination, otherwise, I will feel more at ease. Klein shook his head and muttered to himself. He was in no hurry to jump into the fog of history. He first took out 2 items and handed them to his projection. One of them was a deep black wooden box. It contained the ashes of giant guardian Grozel. Klein had never forgotten his promise. He had originally wanted to wait for Little Sun's second exploration of the Giant King's court before handing him Grozel's ashes and getting him to help do the burial. However, due to various matters, he ended up coming to the Forsaken Land of the Gods and entering the Giant King's court. As for Snowman's ashes, Klein planned on scattering it into the Golden Sea just as he was about to leave the Forsaken Land of the Gods. It was a sea churning with the divine blood of the ancient sun god. After handing over the urn and the black iron key from Vice Admiral Iceberg, Klein followed his usual practice and leaped into the fog. He dashed to the fragment of light that represented a time before the first epoch, and he allowed his consciousness to naturally shift to the projection he had summoned. This projection didn't hold the Staff of the Stars and only wore Creeping Hunger. This was because the palace that the Giant King lived in was still quite a distance away. There were many troll statues blocking him, so Klein couldn't guarantee that he would reach his destination in 5 minutes. Right on the heels of that, he made the glove on his left hand transparent as he disappeared from where he was. In the next second, Klein appeared outside the guard's residence with the huge black iron key. He hadn't teleported too far away. Yes, in the Giant King's court, it's clear that most of the powers within have weakened. Only a guard acknowledged by the Divine Kingdom can perform at relatively normal standards. Beyond powers similar to teleportation have also been suppressed. I can only do blink within a relatively small area. From the looks of it, even if I were to summon the Staff of the Stars, I wouldn't be able to appear outside the Giant King's palace by outlining the corresponding scene in my mind. As expected of an ancient god's divine kingdom, Klein seriously observed the influence his surroundings brought him. After making a preliminary judgment, he turned and walked back to the guard's residence. Opening the wooden box in his right hand, he solemnly scattered Grozel's ashes in every corner. According to the scene he saw in Grozel's dream, this guard's residence was where the giant lived for a long period of time. It was the home that he had the deepest impression and was most fond of. It could be imagined that during that period of time in ancient times, Grozel and the other rational giant guardians from future generations would rest, rabble, gossip, talk about music, and think of fun games to play. They didn't need to worry about food and ailments. They would live every day of their lives happily. With the shaking of Klein's hands, the ashes scattered on the wall, the ground, the bedside, the tables, chairs, and stone pillars. The orange light outside the window shone forever, making everything look peaceful. When the last speck of ashes was scattered, the dusk suddenly deepened. It dyed the scattered ashes orange, becoming a part of the divine kingdom. Klein closed his eyes as though he could sense Grozel's joy. A vagrant who had been forced to leave his hometown for 3,000 years had finally returned to the place he had missed day and night. The light of the dusk softened, making Klein feel that he was less ostracized. It's equivalent to being acknowledged to a certain extent. I've become a guard that has been accepted by a number of people. Klein emanated his spirituality to confirm the changes. He didn't stay any longer. He used Creeping Hunger and the path scouted by the City of Silver's expedition team to constantly blink and take detours. From time to time, he would pull out the unshadowed crucifix. He passed through the hall where the fateful plot was made with relatively little difficulty, and he arrived at the residence of the Giant King. There, he saw a row of huge stone columns on the left that formed railings. Beyond the railings was an orange-red gas and a churning dark blue sea. Taking a deep breath, he returned to the hall he had just exited. He reached out his hand and dragged out the marionette, Enony, who hadn't been parasitized by Aemon. Even if it was a historical projection, he didn't want to open the door himself. Looking at the slightly dazed Enony, Klein handed the black iron key that he had tucked under his armpit over to him. He controlled Enony to leave the hall and follow the railings formed from stone pillars to the tallest and most magnificent building in the Giant King's court. The dusk's glow seemed to be corporeal as it covered the palace's surface, bringing with it a strong sense of decadence, as though the curtains had drawn on everything in the world. Lining both sides of the palace were separately steeples and spires. The grayish-blue front door was covered with mysterious symbols as it stood at a height exceeding 10 meters. To the left of the door, there was a pitch-black hole that was the size of an adult's fist at the height of 3 to 4 meters. Enony stared at it for a few seconds before raising the black iron key that resembled a 7-string guitar and inserting it into the deep crevice in front of him. It fit perfectly without leaving a single gap. As the gigantic black iron key entered the deep hole, Klein held his breath in the nearby grand hall, constantly preparing to remove his existence. With a click, the black iron key in Anony's hand reached the end. It suddenly turned soft, as if it had fused with the hole as it emitted grayish-blue light. The various symbols, labels, and patterns on the door lit up as they protruded. All the lights quickly interfered in a constructive manner, pressing down heavily into the inner chamber as it slowly opened the grayish-blue palace door. The gap between the door widened when Anony's eyes suddenly reflected a turbulent pitch-black, viscous, and illusory sea. Not good. Warning bells sounded in Klein's mind. Without any hesitation, his consciousness returned to his body as he severed the connection with his historical void projection. In the next second, his vision suddenly darkened. The left side of his head felt a sharp pain, as though someone had inserted a red-hot chisel into it and kept rotating it. At the same time, he heard indistinguishable ravings that seemed to come from an era older than ancient times. Klein's expression instantly twisted, appearing extremely ferocious. He could still barely maintain his rationality, but he had no energy left to remain in the historical fragment. Without a sound, Klein landed in the guard residence of the giant king's court. With a thought, he entered the world above the grey fog. Before undertaking such a dangerous task, he had no doubt found a reason and excuse to arrange for the members of the Tarot Club to pray collectively to awaken Sephira Castle's ability to summon its master. This allowed him to skip taking 4 steps counterclockwise and reciting the incantation at critical moments to return above the grey fog. However, just as Klein's spirit body saw the greyish-white fog, he heard a familiar roar. He felt himself be rejected by Sephira Castle, as though it had accepted an order from someone else to stop him from entering. In his shock, he saw a black shadow leap past him, heading straight for Sephira Castle. It wasn't Amon, but a shadow that exuded an aura identical to his. Subconsciously, Klein influenced Sephira Castle and made it reject the intruder. Then, he succeeded. The shadow was also blocked by the grayish-white fog as well. Right on the heels of that, he and the shadow fell back into the real world at the same time. After his spirit body returned to his body, Klein bent down in pain, like a curled shrimp. The half-top hat on his head fell to the ground. He took several seconds to eventually recover. He slowly straightened his body and cast his gaze on a glass window ground from orange gems. The window reflected his current appearance, with the bridge of his nose as a border. His right face was the same as usual, but countless objects were crawling out of his left face. Klein narrowed his eyes. He hurriedly took a deep breath to calm himself down and regain the clown powers of control. His mind outlined a clear image of his appearance. He was dressed in a black trench coat, had black hair and brown eyes. The right side of Gehrman Sparrow's cut face was the same as usual, while the left side had become translucent and was formed from twisting maggots. As he looked down, his neck was in a similar state. It was the same with his body that lay beneath his clothes. The edge of losing control. Man, I need to resist the inclination towards intense madness. Suddenly, he sensed something. He instinctively lowered his head and looked at his feet. It was empty. He was missing the shadow that was supposed to exist. The orange light of the evening shone through the window, but it didn't create a shadow by his side. Haha, I understand. Klein bent down and laughed uncontrollably. He suspected that the seawater that surged out from the giant king's palace had not only drowned his marionette and historical projection, but it had also used the latter to slice off his own shadow, causing his spirit to lose its completeness. He was unable to completely suppress his inclination towards losing control. As for the shadow, which was slightly equivalent to him, it could also affect Sephira Castle. This resulted in a situation in which both parties were unable to head above the grey fog. As long as I get rid of that shadow, the problem can be solved. The corner of his right forehead twitched as he straightened his back. At that moment, the orange light that shone from outside was dyed gold, becoming rather resplendent. It made the entire giant king's court seem to retrograde from dusk to noon. With a thought, he cast his gaze out the window as an image appeared in his mind. In front of the tallest and most magnificent building in the giant king's court, Marionette Enony stood there, facing the door. It was dark past the door, impossible to see anything clearly. Suddenly, Enoni turned around and looked down. His face was covered in a shadow, and his hair turned deep black that draped over his shoulders and curled up slightly. On his back, there were pairs of dark illusory wings. In the grand hall nearby, a pure shadow's lower body was pressed against a stone brick as its upper body came over in a ramrod manner. It's not Dark Angel Sasria. The projection of Enoni has been eroded by the power that surged out from the Giant King's residence, becoming a monster that I can't understand at the moment. Furthermore, it looks like it can exist for a long period of time. Perhaps there's a bit of Sasria's will involved in this. With his left hand covering his face, Klein allowed the worms of spirit to burrow through the gaps in his fingers freely. What he couldn't understand the most was something else. He had clearly opened the palace where the Dark Angel lay slumber, but the deities and kings of angels showed no reaction. According to Klein's imagination, when the surging sea gushed out, be it the true creator, the god of knowledge and wisdom, blasphemer Aemon, or Aemon's brother who ultimately hid behind the scenes, they should have immediately descended or appeared to confirm Dark Angel Sasria's present state or snatch whatever corresponding items. To his surprise, the entire Giant King's court remained completely silent. No external powers exerted any influence. Could it be that they are still waiting for me to enter the Giant King's residence and to come into contact with that deputy of heaven? The true creator said to meet Sasria. My spirit body and physical body haven't recovered from the corrosion, which means that the true creator's goal has yet to be achieved. Ha ha. As Klein's thoughts raced, he realized that he was unable to control his emotions, be it anger, sadness, worry, or depression. He couldn't help but pull the corners of his mouth up and let out a scoff. The only thing he was glad about was that this didn't affect his brain. He could still think and use all sorts of beyonder powers, but sometimes, his madness would suddenly be aggravated, turning him rash and aggressive. I wonder if the demigod of the mind has any way to treat this situation. In any case, the sealed artifacts or beyonder characteristics that I can summon can't do it. This is a result of an incomplete spirit. If I don't resolve my severed shadow, I probably won't be able to completely recover. However, perhaps there are methods that can allow me to temporarily return to normal. For example, create a virtual persona to make up for the incompleteness. Unfortunately, I can't enter Sephira Castle. Klein's thoughts were in a mess as the scenes that surfaced in his mind gradually vanished. He then picked up the half-top hat that had dropped to the ground and wore it. Then, through the huge glass window formed from ground orange gems, he observed the changes in the Giant King's court. Unlike before, an illusory sun appeared high in the sky, allowing the magnificent building complex situated in the frozen sunset to enjoy the sun at noon. The troll statues that stood guard in the various palaces seemed to be draped with a cloak weaved out of shadows. Enoni, who had a pair of black, illusory wings on his back, and the shadow that originally belonged to Klein jumped over the railing and glided towards him. Klein's gaze froze as he subconsciously took a few steps forward, intending to fight the enemy. But very quickly, he snapped back to his senses and checked his current state. He quickly retreated to the ancient elevator, pulled the switch, and landed back in the barren tunnel. Then, with blink, he appeared near the waning forest and ran all the way to the edge of the Giant King's court. His intuition told him that in his current state, he had no means of defeating the mutated Enoni and his separated shadow. Of course, he had the confidence if it was just the latter. When he arrived at the edge of the radiant sunlight, he turned and saw that Enoni and his shadow hadn't chased after him. It was as though there was a limit to their range of activity. There's no way to leave the Giant King's residence, or should I say, be too far away from Dark Angel Sasria. Just as this thought flashed through his mind, Klein saw the illusionary sun atop leap from the center to the west. The dusk's colors once again enveloped the divine kingdom. Klein carefully observed all of this and was in no hurry to leave the Giant King's court. Not long after, the illusory sun plunged into the palace where Dark Angel Sasria slumbered. Darkness became the ruler of the Giant King's court. The darkness was different from the one found on a normal night. There was no moon or starlight, only blurry shadows. Standing in this darkness, Klein had a nagging feeling that someone was clinging to him from behind. However, he clearly knew that it was an illusion and didn't turn around recklessly. A few minutes later, the illusory sun rose, and the light of dawn dispersed the darkness. The power that surged out from the Dark Angel's chamber has changed the Giant King's court despite it being an ancient divine kingdom. It really is a power that's close to that of a true deity. At the very least, it controls a uniqueness, but which pathway's uniqueness would it be? The generated changes include blazing sun, darkness, degeneration, and mutation. This is a little contradictory. It doesn't seem like the result of a single uniqueness. Besides, the uniqueness of the sun pathway is definitely with the eternal blazing sun. The shadow and degeneration is brought about by darkness, which is undoubtedly with the true creator. When I opened the door, I saw an illusory, pitch-black, viscous ocean. It's related to the Chaos Sea. Klein shook his head as he continued observing. This continued on as he waited for the City of Silver's expedition team to rendezvous with him. Backland, at the border of the city. As soon as Audrey entered, she discovered that the fog had become unusually thick. Visibility had been reduced to 5 meters. The howling winds swept through the fog, bringing a sense of clarity from time to time. However, it was soon filled with surging whiteness. Audrey's eyes suddenly turned golden, allowing her to see even further. As she carefully treaded, the fog in front of her suddenly became much thinner. At the same time, her Beyonder powers suffered a retrogression. The weakening of mysticism. The concepts and information previously mentioned by Mr. World flashed across her mind. Boom, boom, boom. Multiple salvos from Backland fired ahead, causing the shells to leave trails of red, blue, silver, or black in their wake as they bombarded the enemy's base. However, in the next second, these shells encountered invisible barriers and exploded in midair, making the transparent wall tremble. At this moment, a rather blurry figure appeared in the distant, thick fog. He was in human form, but he was more than 10 meters tall. His torso and waist each had 2 arms extending out as he emitted a rich darkness. For some reason, as the figure that seemed to arise from a legend appeared, the Fezak and Inti's allied forces base stirred. Every soldier and officer there seemed to have returned to their childhood. They were walking alone on the dark road with no one around them. Everything was silent. They felt uneasy deep down. The fear of the unknown stemmed from the fear of their imaginations. Instantly, they broke down and turned to flee. At this moment, radiant sunlight shone on them, allowing them to see light and bringing them courage. However, there was still a small number of soldiers who were unable to control themselves. They kept shouting, "Mommy," or a particular woman's name in their bids to escape from the battlefield. Bang, bang, bang. The soldiers fell to the ground amidst repeated gunshots. One by one, they bloomed with blood-colored flowers. They landed on the ground, turning motionless after slightly twitching. No one cared what their names were, nor did anyone know of their past. Right on the heels of that, under the commanding officer's orders, the invisible barrier that enveloped the Intis and Fezak allied forces was dispelled. Crimson-red flaming spears were thrown out towards the Loan base as though they could blot out the sky. Just as the flaming spears approached their target, they scattered in a sudden bout of chaos. They stabbed into the ground, creating one pitch-black hole after another. It was the first time Audrey was seeing such a large-scale usage of Beyonder powers. Momentarily stunned, she couldn't help but recall the people she knew and the roles they played in this battle. Blaint and the other young nobles had joined the army and took on the roles of officers at different ranks. They were scattered all over the battlefield and could be killed at any moment. The magician had left Backland with Judgment's family and was hiding in a small city in East Chester County. As a middle-ranking member of Mi-9, Judgment was made to covertly defend against infiltration by the Beyonders from Fezak, Intis, and other countries. The official Beyonders led by the Star had locked down the various cathedrals of the Church of Steam, maintaining the stability of the city. Saint Anthony and the other demigods of the Church of Evernite, the Church of Storms, the royal family, and the military began to set up the last line of defense in Backland. The Sanguine had remained neutral the entire time. A few seconds later, Audrey gathered her thoughts and prepared to use psychological invisibility to sneak into the enemy's camp to spread mental plague. Suddenly, her spiritual perception stirred as she cast her gaze to a spot further away. In the thick fog, a rather thick and blurry tentacle wrapped around countless silver bolts of lightning and quickly extended to a certain location of the Allied forces' base. A feather burning with golden flames fell. In the depths of the thick fog, a huge grayish-blue palm reached out, holding a silver broadsword. Ellipsis. The fog sea, away from the safe sea route. Countless bolts of lightning struck the surface of the sea, waves surged and crashed heavily. Bernadette's dawn was constantly being thrown into the sky, making it seem extremely minute under the might of the elements. It looked like it would sink at any moment. Queen Mystic stood at the bow of the ship, calmly taking in all of this. From time to time, she would use the Emperor's new clothes and other fairy tale magic to maintain the balance of the boat. Her gaze pierced through the terrifying storm in search of the suspected primitive island. After some reorganizing, Colin Iliad led Derek, Lovia, and the other members of the expedition team out of Afternoon Town Camp. They followed the path up the mountain and entered the giant king's court. What surprised them was that the frozen dusk had changed. Bright sunlight illuminated every corner. "Where's the help you invited?" Colin Iliad controlled his alarm and turned to ask Derek Berg. Just as Derek was about to speak, he suddenly saw a figure walk out from a half-collapsed tower. The figure wore a black trench coat and a silk top hat. The right side of his face was cut, cold and stiff. The left side of his face had transparent, wriggling maggots that kept crawling. Report chapter. When they saw the figure walking out from behind the collapsed tower, the members of the City of Silver's expedition team immediately put up a defensive stance, ready to attack or provide any defense. In their eyes, the man wearing strange clothes and a strange hat was equivalent to a monster, a particularly terrifying one at that. Even normal Beyonders would view themselves as monsters after being subject to such a physical mutation. Upon seeing the reactions of the half-giants, Klein grinned widely and said with a beaming smile, "Hello everyone, I'm Gaemon Sparrow. All of you should be glad that I can still control myself. Otherwise, you would have lost your minds because you looked at me directly." As he spoke, the transparent maggots on the left side of his face and neck were still squirming slowly. Beneath the clothes on the left side of his body, there were protruding marks that gently squirmed. A monster. The members of the City of Silver who were not demigods were increasingly certain of their own judgment. You are the war, no, Mr. Sparrow." Derek Berg finally managed to recognize Mr. World, who he had met once. Klein raised his left palm and covered his left cheek. He smiled and said, "Life is always about encountering the unexpected." Without waiting for Little Sun to respond, he paused and said, "I have already opened the door to the Giant King's residence." This brought about some accidents, causing the Divine Kingdom to change. The door to the Giant King's residence has already been opened. The grizzled and scarred Colin Iliad narrowed his eyes. He subconsciously looked up at the magnificent buildings shrouded in golden sunlight. However, due to the distance, he couldn't see the situation at the apex. However, to have the frozen sunset become replaced by the blazing sun at noon had explained many things. Klein's gaze swept across the City of Silver's chief and elder Lovia, who was dressed in black armor, of the six-member council. He then looked at the sun and continued with a smile, "This has also brought me some negative effects, just as you have already noticed." At this point, he clapped his hands and said in a commanding tone, like an adult instructing children, "All right, Beyonders below the level of demigod are to fall back. The Giant King's court after the anomaly is not a place you can enter." The members of the expedition team, apart from Colin, Derek, and Lovia, felt an inexplicable sense of fear as they cast their gazes at the chief. Colin Iliad remained silent for a few seconds before turning to them and saying, "Leave the Giant King's court and wait at the periphery. If you see the signal, immediately act according to plan." The handpicked expedition team members were not only strong themselves and close in strength to a demigod, but they also had different powerful sealed artifacts that complemented each other. Even if they were facing Ascent, they weren't without hope when it came to defeating one. However, in the City of Silver's original plan, they weren't the main force. Therefore, Colin Iliad had led them here in the hope that, when he and the other demigods shaved off the hidden enemies, these team members would be able to shine. They could then use the different sealed artifacts to deal with different incidents, preventing the entire team from suffering from any weaknesses. Now, with powerful help from the outside joining him, and the fact that the Giant King's court had indeed experienced some sort of anomaly, no one knew what they would encounter if they went deeper. With the utmost caution, Colin Iliad believed that Gaemon Sparrow's suggestion wasn't a problem. Furthermore, he had his own selfish thoughts. He didn't want members other than the demigods to suffer any unnecessary risks or meaningless casualties. Therefore, he agreed to the opinion of the monster-like powerhouse. When the time came for an opportunity to show itself, he, Lovia, and Derek would be able to give a signal and let the team members rush over a cleared path to provide reinforcements. As for the entire team's Beyonder powers not being able to deal with different situations due to collectively becoming relatively monotonous, Colin Iliad wasn't too worried since the former shepherd, Lovia, was around. The members of the expedition, who weren't demigods, exchanged looks and hesitated for a moment. In the end, they still chose to listen to Colin Iliad. "Yes, Your Excellency." At the same time that they answered, they gave Derek Berg a deep look, as though they were trying to remind their chief to be careful of this sequence 4 demigod. He actually knew a living, monster-like powerhouse. This was very suspicious to the residents of the City of Silver, who had barely seen any outsiders. Sensing his companion's obvious distrust, Derek's heart ached as his eyes nearly welled up in tears. But eventually, he didn't make any excuses. He maintained his silence and straightened his back. After the other members of the expedition team retreated from the Giant King's court, Klein smiled and pointed at the two demigods. "Let me guess. You must be the chief of the City of Silver, the former demon hunter, the present Silver Knight, Colin Iliad. You are the Hanged Man's believer, Black Knight Lovia, who had helped him, shepherd." Lovia's grey eyes, which were hidden behind her visor, narrowed. "You really look like a clown. The Hanged Man." Upon hearing Mr. World's words, Derek almost doubted his ears. He even imagined that Elder Lovia had something to do with Mr. Hanged Man, but he quickly remembered the exact image of the fallen creator, a naked man hanging upside down on a cross. Mr. World used the Hanged Man to refer to the fallen creator. Elder Lovia chided him for being impolite. Derek, who had just exceeded 2 meters in height, nodded thoughtfully as he praised Mr. World's guts from the bottom of his heart. He actually dared to give a true deity a nickname, and even said it out loud in front of his follower. Colin Iliad looked at Gehrman Sparrow and then at Lovia. Unable to tell who was right or wrong, he calmly said, "Let's continue moving forward." He had already pulled out the 2 swords on his back and allowed him to be blanketed with the dawn's glow. "No problem." With a smile, Klein turned around and walked to the left of a huge stone staircase with the 3 demigods of the City of Silver. After walking for a while, they saw the familiar rugged pathway. On one side of the road was a towering cliff, and on the other side was an afternoon sun-soaked, bottomless cloud. At this moment, Klein and company felt the vibrations of the ground. They saw large amounts of illusory, pitch-black gases surging out from deep within the golden cloud. With a whoosh, the rugged pathway collapsed, falling into the dark, water surface. Beneath the water surface, there seemed to be invisible maelstroms lurking. "Ha ha, it collapsed. There's no way out. Ha ha." Klein bent down laughing loudly, making Colin's, Derek's, and Lovia's nerves tense up. It took Klein a few seconds to regain control of his emotions. He straightened his body and took out a piece of white paper from his pocket with a smile plastered across his face. He folded it into a plane. "Phew." He blew at the head of the paper plane, swung his arm, and threw it towards the clouds that had been devoured by darkness. At the same time, the glove on his left hand was covered with slippery fish scales. Upon seeing this scene, the originally confused Colin Iliad nodded slightly before casting his gaze at the flying paper object. A violent wind stirred as it carried the paper plane forward in flight for a few seconds. Then, it suddenly dissipated, and like a stone, it rapidly plummeted into the dark clouds, without causing any ripples. From the looks of it, flying is useless. Klein turned halfway around and smiled at Derek and company. Lovia didn't respond as she released a translucent soul that enveloped a piece of gravel. In the blink of an eye, that piece of rock disappeared from its original spot, blinking, to a spot above the dark clouds. Following that, it fell down uncontrollably and sank into the clouds. "Teleport doesn't work either," Lovia said in a slightly deep voice. As Klein pressed at his abdomen, he bent down and chuckled before saying, "It looks like we can only enter through the main entrance." Derek immediately turned around and was about to head back when Colin Iliad and Lovia looked at each other and nodded indiscernibly. The 4 demigods quickly returned to the huge, grayish-white stone staircase and looked up. Above the flight of silent stairs which had very high steps, the majestic city walls were covered with burn marks. There were even arrows shafts as thick as ordinary trees. In the middle of the city wall was a door that was tens of meters tall. It was grayish-blue in color and there were golden nails embedded on its surface. On both sides of the door stood a guard that stood at 6 meters tall in a domineering manner. They wore exquisite silver full-body armor, one holding a great sword, the other a huge axe. Behind their visors was an orange glow. Silver Knight. These were 2 Silver Knight's guards. Without wasting any time, Colin Iliad quickly retracted his gaze and said to Gehrman Sparrow, "I'll hold back one of the Silver Knights. Quickly finish off the other one." He wasn't very sure of Gehrman Sparrow's strength, but from the admiration and respect that he sensed from Derek Berg, as well as the fact that he had opened up the residence of the Giant King, he determined that this demigod who was blessed by the Fool was no weaker than him. Under such circumstances, whether it was Gehrman Sparrow or Colin Iliad, it wasn't difficult for them to quickly kill a Silver Knight guard with the help of Lovia and Derek. After all, they weren't living demigods, but a special statue without any intelligence. Just as Colin Iliad finished his sentence, he saw Gehrman Sparrow bend his back and laugh out loud. "Why do you care so much about these two toys? If they were still alive and could think, real Silver Knights, I would definitely be as cautious as you are. But now, haha. Watch." As he spoke, Klein used his left hand, which had many worms of spirit crawling about, to press down on his top hat. He straightened his body and briskly walked up the stairs. Then, he was surrounded by strong winds as he approached the main door of the Giant King's court. During this process, he casually raised his right hand and shook it a few times, as if he was stretching his wrist or grabbing the air. At the end of the last action, Klein's shoulder sank slightly as if it had frozen, but nothing appeared in the void. Colin Iliad originally wanted to have an understanding of Gehrman Sparrow's strength, so he didn't stop him. He only signaled for Lovia to follow, to back him up if he made any mistakes. However, at that moment, he suddenly slowed down. He frowned slightly as if he had caught the scent of something. As for Derek, he looked at him with slight admiration. He believed that Mr. World could quickly finish off the guards. Only when Klein was about to reach the end of the flight of stone steps did the two Silver Knights guards outside the Giant King's court react. They turned their heads as the orange glow behind their visors flashed twice, as though it was confirming the identity of the visitor. Furthermore, they had a moment of confusion. Half of Klein's face was normal, and the other half was terrifying. The right side of his mouth curled up exaggeratedly. The transparent maggots on his left slowly twisted, revealing a frightening and indifferent smile. Thud. With his right foot crossing the final step, he arrived at the platform where the Giant King's court was located. Suddenly, a silvery white crack appeared on Klein's forehead as countless silver rays emitted from his body. His entire body instantly shattered into pieces of flesh and blood. These fragments floated up and quickly thinned and faded, turning into paper shreds. Klein in his top hat and black trench coat appeared one after another in different spots. However, they were all ripped apart by the silver sword beams. Some of them degenerated into illusions, while others turned into paper figures. At this moment, a figure suddenly appeared outside the main door of the Giant King's court where two guards had disappeared. It was a huge doll dressed in a dark and complicated long dress with evil vines wrapped around it. Rionette Tinnicker. When Klein climbed up the stone steps, the person he summoned was none other than Miss Messenger. However, she had appeared in wraith form, so Colin Iliad, Lovia, and Derek didn't see her. At this moment, the two Silver Knights who had concealed their evil intentions and were hiding with the help of the light were chasing Klein out of instinct. They had already exposed their whereabouts after the angel-level powerhouse's prolonged observations. Rionette Tinniker's bright red eyes immediately reflected a seemingly blank area. There was a flash of light, and a white rabbit suddenly jumped out of nowhere. It bounced around and circled the area, its eyes abnormally vapid. Immediately following that, Miss Messenger took a step forward and disappeared. In another area, the remaining knight in silver armor appeared. His actions turned stiff and slow. He had been possessed by a wraith. Klein, who had used himself as bait, stopped, blinking. He pressed his hand to his chest and gave a very ceremonial bow. "I found the two of you. I wish you well." He straightened his body, raised his right hand, and snapped his fingers. Boom! The white-furred rabbit suddenly exploded, its flesh splattering all over the ground. Then, he walked towards the Silver Knight guard who tried his best to struggle but to no avail. When the two figures crossed each other, Rionette Tinniker's historical projection returned to the fog of history, while the Silver Knight followed closely behind Klein and very obediently returned to the edge of the stone steps with him. He had already become Klein's marionette. "We can enter." Klein smiled as he said to Colin Iliad and the others at the bottom of the stone stairs. Derek's eyes lit up as he inwardly marveled. Mr. World is really powerful. He managed to finish off two Silver Knight guards single-handedly so quickly. Colin Iliad turned his head to glance at Lovia. From her gaze, he could sense her heavy emotions. The City of Silver's chief had no change in expression. He held the two swords that refracted the light of dawn and steadily walked up the stone steps. He came to Klein's side and whispered, "Mutant." Klein pressed down a worm of spirit that formed his left eye and smiled without answering. After Derek and Lovia walked up the stairs, the four demigods and a marionette turned and arrived at the main door of the Giant King's court. During this process, Klein stowed away the Silver Knight beyond a characteristic that had seeped out from the rabbit. This was a reward for Rionette Tinniker. According to the agreement between him and the Angel, the spoils of war that Klein had obtained from summoning a historical projection would be split equally with Miss Messenger. Rionette Tinnicker took the Beyonder characteristic, while Klein obtained a Silver Knight marionette. He looked up at the main door and made the Silver Knight guard, who was much taller than him, take a few steps forward and insert the sword into the ground. Then, the Silver Knight bent down and stretched out his hands to press on the door that was dozens of meters tall. After a heavy screeching sound, the door with golden nails slowly opened. At this moment, the sun in the sky leaped, and the entire Giant King's court froze into an orange-red dusk. The huge door opened faster and faster, and the scene inside was gradually revealed to Klein and company. A grayish-white figure was covered in orange-red light. Countless stairs extended from behind the door all the way to the tallest and most magnificent residence of the Giant King. On the way, there were no obstacles. There were palaces and towers on both sides. Giant statues covered in iron-colored armor stood in front of different buildings, guarding the path that led to the residences of the god. "It's time for you to perform." Klein turned his head to the side and gave an exaggerated smile to Colin Iliad and Lovia. The former demon hunter, Colin, nodded slightly without any objections. Behind Lovia, an illusory figure covered in silver armor with dark red eyes that was several meters tall appeared. Pa, pa, pa. The giant statues on both sides of the Divine Kingdom's staircase emitted silvery white beams as they emitted shattering sounds. The silver flowers that bloomed kept spreading upwards as if they were welcoming the guests. Before long, 3 silver knights, Colin Iliad, the soul, grazed by Lovia, and the marionette controlled by Klein, cleared out the giant statues guarding the Divine Kingdom's staircase, leaving only the area closest to the Giant King's residence. They didn't attempt it out of caution. At that moment, 2 figures flew out of the Giant King's palace and slid towards the 3 silver knights. One of them had a shadowed face, black, curly hair that reached its shoulders, and a pair of black wings on its back. The other was a pure shadow that distorted to the sides from time to time. They were Enony, who had mutated at some point in time, and Klein's shadow, who were both under the influence of the Dark Angel. In the battlefield filled with thick fog, a layer of grayish-white dragon scales suddenly appeared on Audrey's body. This was a result of her seeing something she shouldn't see. Even with the fog blocking her view, high-level creatures at the angel level could still corrupt and damage living beings that saw them. As a demigod of the spectator pathway, Audrey immediately retracted her gaze and calmed her mind to control herself from losing control. As her thoughts raced, she took a few steps back and used psychological invisibility to hide in the thick fog. She was in no hurry to infiltrate the Intis and Fazak allied forces camp. She was waiting for an opportunity, one that she believed would definitely appear. Time passed by so slowly that Audrey imagined that it had stopped. After an unknown period of time, she finally saw the fog over the Allied forces' base turn dark, like the sun plunging past the horizon. Night had begun to rule this world. Silently, the Intis, Fazak soldiers and officers closed their eyes and fell asleep. This included many other Beyonders. Audrey, who was hiding not far away, also fell asleep. However, as a dreamwalker who had been cued in advance, she managed to stay lucid. Then, without knowing how long the opportunity would last, she used dream traversal to enter the Intis, Fazak allied forces base. She walked among the soldiers and secretly left behind the seeds for a mental plague. This plague could make the infected panic, fluster, and break down emotionally. It was difficult to be placated with normal methods. Hum. The sound of a horn pierced through the gaps between reality and dreams, shattering the hazy world and awakening the soldiers and officers. Audrey didn't hesitate. At the instant before the dream completely shattered, she traversed to the other end of the camp, far away from the group that had planted the seeds of mental plague. In the next second, the dream world completely collapsed, forcing her back into reality. She appeared at the borders of the Intis, Fazak allied forces base. Thud. A silvery white beam lit up, exploding beside Audrey, tearing apart the fog. Audrey didn't panic because being attacked was within her expectations. After entering the Intis, Fazak allied forces camp, she knew that her psychological invisibility was very likely to be seen through by others using other clues, such as not being able to completely conceal her malice. Therefore, apart from her psychological invisibility, she also used similar techniques and Hand of Horrors, disorder, to create another fake version of herself to mislead the possible attackers. In other words, there was still a layer of illusion hidden under her psychological invisibility. And the facts proved that Audrey's understanding of the enemy was correct. The fake version of her had indeed encountered a sudden attack. Taking this opportunity, she retreated into the depths of the fog. Then, a grayish-white dragon that was still in human form appeared. It had mysterious and three-dimensional symbols engraved on its huge scales. They were infiltrating inwards and extending outwards, as though they were interweaving into something indescribable. Something that didn't belong to reality would cause one's mind to go into a frenzy and distort their thoughts just by looking at it. At the same time, a figure dressed in a Phazak general's attire appeared at the spot where Audrey was standing. His face, neck, and palm were covered in silver armor, giving off a cold feeling. Enony and Klein's shadows landed on a platform covered in orange light. The three silver knights retreated and returned to Derek's and Klein's side. Klein raised his hand to cover his left cheek and laughed at the shadow and Enony. "It looks like you can't leave that area." He took a few steps forward and spread out his palms. He tsked and said, "What a pity. That way, you won't be able to hit me." Bang! The shadow opened its mouth and released an air cannon. Bang! When the shadow blasted an air cannon forward, Klein acted as though he had sensed it ahead of time. His body jerked backward, and he somersaulted in the air, landing steadily several steps away. During this process, his right hand continued to press down on the half-top hat on his head, making him seem rather relaxed. Seeing that Enony and the shadow didn't attempt to chase and continue their attacks, the smile on his face became even more obvious. "It's really impolite to interrupt others while they're speaking. I wanted to discuss how to deal with you in front of all of you, but I can only avoid that now." As he spoke, his left face, which formed from a cluster of transparent maggots, trembled twice, as if he was trying to wink at his former marionette and his former shadow. Then, with a beaming smile on his face, he walked back to Colin Iliad, Derek, and Lovia and shrugged. "The owners of this place aren't welcoming us. We can only head out and discuss how to resolve the problem, them." Colin Iliad didn't think lowly of this exaggerated powerhouse just because he didn't seem capable of controlling his emotions. This was because he had shown his expertise and meticulousness towards detail when handling the previous matters. This wasn't something a demigod who had lost his mind could do. "All right." The City of Silver's chief responded to Klein's suggestion. Of course, Derek had no objections, while Lovia remained silent and didn't say a word. Hence, the four demigods and the Silver Knight marionette retraced their steps. They walked out of the giant king's court's door, and Klein even got the silver-armored guard to pull the huge door and slowly close it. It appeared like a very polite gesture. Throughout the entire process, Enony, who had layers of black wings on his back, and the pure shadow, just stood watching. They didn't attempt to stop him, as though an invisible wall had restrained their movements. After a while, dusk dissipated and darkness descended. All awaited the light of dawn to illuminate everything. In this quiet and dead world, a ray of light finally rose, bringing with it a long-awaited dawn. At this moment, Enony and the shadow heard knocking sounds at the door of the giant king's court. Someone was knocking on the door. Knock, knock, knock. After this continued a few more times, the door let out a creaking sound as it opened heavily. Wearing a black trench coat, Klein maintained the smile on the right side of his face as he entered the giant king's court first. He walked up the stairs step by step, and the other demigods, along with his marionette, followed one step behind. After reaching the end of the halfway, Klein stopped and said to Enony and the shadow, who were more than 10 meters away, "Please forgive me for not waiting for you to say, 'Come in.' Perhaps it's because this spot is too far from the main door, so you didn't hear my knocking. As you know, as a gentleman, I only know how to use my fingers to strike, not slap with my palms." The moment he finished speaking, Enony, who hadn't spoken since the beginning, spoke. "Next, you'll deal with Shadow by yourself and let the people of the City of Silver hold me back." "Oh." Klein let out a loud nasal grunt while wearing an exaggerated smile, as though he was waiting for Enony to give a further explanation. At the same time, he raised his left hand and pressed his face. The transparent and twisted maggots began to squirm about, some boring in, others crawling out and quickly completing an exchange. With a shadow over his face, Enony, with his black, slightly curled hair that reached his shoulders, continued in a deep voice, "You didn't summon a projection from the historical void in advance because you know that Shadow can summon the projection of the Staff of the Stars and simulate the powers of the Angel of Time. It will accelerate the flow of time to disperse your angel helpers." Similarly, he didn't make any preparations because of the same reason. And if you summon a scent that can last longer, he can do the same. Both of you offset each other. I hate playing cards with myself. Klein nodded heavily, expressing his agreement, and laughed out loud. Enony, whose face was blurry, glanced at him and the three demigods of the City of Silver. Therefore, you turned the Silver Knight guarding the door into your marionette, planning on using it as a chip to tip the balance. This problem is his, not mine. He actually doesn't have a target to turn into a marionette. Or perhaps, why don't you sacrifice yourself? The corners of Klein's mouth curled up as he said to his former marionette, Enony. Enony retracted his gaze and turned to examine Colin Iliad, Derek, and Lovia. You and Shadow cancel each other out. The prerequisite for using a marionette to win is that they can hold me back. Just as he said that, the two shoulders of the marionette that had been corrupted by the power of the sleeping dark angel squirmed as a head grew out of each. The three heads were covered in shadows and had black curly hair that reached his shoulders. However, they gave people the feeling that one was young and the other old. Before Klein and the demigods could react, Enony's right body suddenly tore apart, causing the aged head to take away a third of his body. The body that split apart rapidly squirmed and instantly became complete. On the shadow over the head's surface, a pair of eyes protruded with vertical, pale golden pupils. Suddenly, the magnificent staircase leading to the ancient god's residence collapsed, turning into a desolate moor. At the end of the moor was a pitch-black city overgrown with weeds. City of Silver. Derek's heart tightened upon seeing such a realistic scene. He was worried that the unknown enemy would drag him and the other demigods to the City of Silver and destroy it. As for Lovia, her gaze froze as her body trembled when Enony grew two heads. It was as if she could sense the aura of an absolute high-leveled entity. Colin Iliad surveyed his surroundings and crossed his two swords that were covered in the light of dawn before pushing him out. He said in a deep voice, "This is fake." At this moment, Klein covered his mouth with his left hand that was made of transparent maggots. He yawned and asked Enony's main body with a smile, "Will you be stronger in dreams? Or can you cross the boundary and launch an attack?" "Yes, if it were me, I would definitely consider using a dream to lure the enemy into entering my attack range." The moment he said that, the desolate moor and the distant castle dissipated at the same time. The magnificent staircase, which was illuminated by the light of dawn, appeared once again. At this moment, the left side of Enony's body tore away. The young head had taken away a third of his flesh. The shadow covering his face was quickly replaced by a resplendent golden light. It was as if there were two miniature suns in his eyes. The sun. Klein first voiced out a question before laughing so hard that he couldn't straighten his back. "Haha, you want to use the unshadowed Domain to break through the Silver Knights, light concealment. Yes, we have 3 Silver Knights on our side. That is worthy of your attention, but have you considered the feelings of Shadow? You don't, you only think of yourself. He's only a shadow, so have you considered how weakened he would be in the unshadowed Domain?" At this point, Klein laughed even louder. Even the transparent worms of spirit crawling on his left face sped up their movements. "Ha ha ha ha. Also, have you thought about the beyonder powers of corruption, degeneration, and darkness? Have you seriously considered the negative effects that the unshadowed Domain will bring you?" After laughing, Klein straightened his back and asked seriously, "How should I address you now?" "Eneen. You. Nini." Enony, whose main body was still covered in shadows, slowly took a deep breath and said, "If you had chosen the hunter pathway, you would definitely be stronger than you are now." Before he could finish his sentence, the layers of black wings on his back suddenly spread out. They kept expanding, covering the sky and wrapped towards the magnificent staircase. Faint shadows immediately covered the area. Then, Enony directly crossed the invisible boundary and descended in front of Colin Iliad, Lovia, and Derek. He actually had the means to break through the obstruction. The young him, who had split off as the Sun Saint, immediately raised his arms. The light of dawn turned blazing hot, illuminating every corner of the magnificent staircase, leaving no shadows. Nothing could hide within unshadowed domain. However, the shadows around him didn't fade. The dark wings that enveloped Enony's body blocked out pure sunlight. As for Shadow, it seemed to be covered in a cloak. Although it was much dimmer, it didn't show any signs of weakness. At the same time, Enony's split-off aged body pushed out his right palm. A violent but illusory gust of wind appeared around him, carrying with it an invisible, multicolored intent that gushed towards Klein and his Silver Knight marionette. Mind deprivation. It could awe the target, make him feel fear, show signs of frenzy, or lose a portion of his rationality. And now, because Klein's spirit was incomplete, he was on the brink of losing control. He couldn't even control his emotions and reactions very well. If he were to suffer the effects of mind deprivation, there was a high chance that he would lose control on the spot and break down into a monster. Enemy understood what had happened to him and understood his weakness. The moment he launched the attack, he allowed the Spectator Saint to use an area of effect attack that Klein would find difficult to defend against and find unbearable. The strong winds that were tainted with all kinds of emotions and will instantly engulfed Klein. However, half of the crazy adventurer, who had half a normal body and half a terrifying body, didn't show any sign of warped expressions, manifestation of godhood, or physical breakdown. Instead, his exaggerated smiling right eye became extremely calm. While waiting for the City of Silver's expedition team, he had already summoned Miss Justice and got her to make up a virtual persona that stemmed from his lampooning, clown-like character, allowing his spirit to become complete for a certain amount of time. This was the reason why he appeared relatively rational when he left the guard's residence, only to appear exaggerated and crazy when he rendezvoused with the City of Silver's expedition team. Furthermore, this virtual persona could also withstand several attacks from the mind domain. The coldness in his eyes quickly faded away. The corner of his right lip curled up, becoming symmetrical with a curled worm of spirit that was crawling on the left. This was a sincere smile. As the smile of sincerity appeared on Klein's face, the face of the Spectator Saint that enemy had split suddenly cracked open. The silver cracks were all over the place, intertwining with each other, appearing extremely chaotic. Klein seized the opportunity and used his Silver Knight Marionette's silver sword to condenser, silver rapier, to attack him. A sharp light shot out, dicing that figure into countless small pieces. However, these small blocks were abnormally illusory, with zero corporealness. The Spectator Saint had used the technique of psychological invisibility to create an illusion, concealing his existence. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Silver beams of light either blazed towards the Spectator Saint that enemy had split off, or directly leaped out from the target's location, erupting from within. The Spectator Saint relied on the speed and agility that a powerful body brought. He constantly changed positions and dodged, preventing himself from getting injured. As he had a precise understanding and control of his psyche and mind, Klein's intuition for danger prevented an image from forming in his mind, so it was difficult for Klein to predict his actions. Therefore, Klein couldn't let the silver rapier lay in wait and strike out where he appeared. Tap, tap, tap. The huge knight, who was covered in solid silver armor, held his broadsword and charged at his target, as though he could topple a mountain. Due to the existence of the unshadowed domain, Klein's Silver Knight Marionette was unable to hide himself using the light. He could only directly attack. Upon seeing this, the Spectator Saint's body suddenly swelled, turning into a hideous, grayish-white scaled dragon that was covered in shadows, a manifestation of godhood. The dragon's body was huge, its gray scales firm. Its claws were powerful, and it managed to block the Silver Knight's slash. Bang, 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 bang. The giant and the giant dragon smashed through the brick rocks of the ancient divine kingdom, causing the palace to collapse. It was a mess. Klein maintained his exaggerated smile and seriously controlled his marionette to ignore Shadow. No, he still did some level of interference. He controlled the spirit body threads of himself, the marionette, the City of Silver's chief, Lovia, and Little Sun, preventing them from being controlled by Shadow. From time to time, he would reach out his hand and summon the historical projection that Shadow was attempting to summon. This effectively cancelled out both parties' efforts. Apart from that, Klein didn't even glance at Shadow. Shadow wandered for a while before opening its mouth helplessly and making a bang sound. An air cannon shot out and struck the Silver Knight marionette before exploding. Amidst the rumbling sound, the marionette only shook slightly before returning to normal. The silver armor he wore didn't show a single crack. Ha ha. Upon seeing this scene, Klein laughed out loud, giving off the feeling that he was about to bend over in a fit of laughter. How could he not be aware of how weak his attacks and defense were? When the two core skills of controlling spirit body threads and the summoning of the historical void projections were rendered ineffective, Shadow, who had no marionettes, could only watch from the side. Be it air cannons, flame controlling, illusion creation, or the clown's combat ability, they were all just embellishments or support. Likewise, Klein didn't attack Shadow, because he knew how frustrating it was to deal with paper figurine substitutes, flaming jump, damage transfer, and illusion creation. He knew that there was no way he could deal with the other party in such a short period of time. He might as well let him be a member of the live audience. After all, he couldn't affect the battle. Upon hearing the mocking laughter, the pitch-black Shadow froze for a moment before pouncing forward. It approached Klein and targeted him with attacks. On the other side, when Anani's true form landed in front of the three demigods of the City of Silver, Colin Iliad quickly glanced at Derek before looking away. He crossed his swords, forming a cross that blocked the path ahead. While doing this City of Silver chief's clothes tore apart by his rapidly expanding muscles. In the blink of an eye, Colin Iliad had turned into a giant that was nearly 6 meters tall. His body was grayish-blue and his muscles were bluish-black. He was a ripped giant. There was a dark crack on his forehead that seemed to be capable of attracting the souls around him, and his eyes were gone. Every inch of the giant's skin and flesh contained immense power, infinite mystery, and a strange spiritual influence. It made everyone who witnessed it inevitably feel a sharp pain in their psyche, turning them into a rampaging mess that wanted to destroy everything, including themselves. Inside the unshadowed domain, Colin Iliad didn't need to worry that the Divine Kingdom's suppression would prevent him from controlling this incomplete mythical creature form, causing him to completely lose control. The invisible barrier around him immediately shrank, turning into silver, sticky, liquid metal that covered his entire body and solidified into an armor that couldn't be shaken. At that moment, the shadow on Anani's body condensed into something corporeal. It made him turn into a giant that was several meters tall. He held a black great sword and wore black full-body armor. Black Knight. Clang! The black great sword cleaved straight down and was held back in midair by two swords formed from the light of dawn. The shadow beneath Anani's feet and the illusory black wings on his back extended outwards in an attempt to envelop Colin Iliad. Almost at the same time, rays of the light of dawn formed around Colin as they swept forward. The storm that was filled with pure fragments of light swallowed Anani's shadow, only to be blocked by his black wings. Clang, 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 bang, bang, bang. Colin Iliad's Silver Knight manifestation and Anani's Black Knight transformation clashed violently, producing a spectacular light show as the tower collapsed. As for Derek, he leaped out with Thunder God's roar in hand after receiving the chief's signal, heading straight for the Sun Saint. Amidst the howling winds, he brandished the ghostly blue hammer that was wrapped in lightning. He appeared like a sailor of the storm pathway, not a beyonder of the sun domain. The Sun Saint never expected that the unshadowed opposite him would be so rash that he chose to engage in close combat. Unable to react in time, he could only use his instincts to dodge to the side. With a loud crack, a silvery white light burst out from the place he was about to step in. It quickly engulfed him and tore his body apart. The Silver Knight evil spirit that Lovia grazed also targeted the Sun Saint as it unleashed its attacks. A golden glow surged out of the Sun Saint's body like a tidal wave, melting the silvery white light, forming a layer of armor made of light, and a huge mace. Boom! The mace blocked Thunder God's roar, causing the snaking bolts and light to fly everywhere. At the same time, the Sun Saint's body emitted a warm glow that caused the Silver Knight evil spirit to suddenly turn illusory as if it was evaporating. It caused the black-armored Lovia's body to pale. The degenerate aura quickly dissipated, causing the Silver Knight marionette to weaken greatly. Purification. This was the core power of an unshadowed. It was extremely effective against wraiths, the fallen, and the unclean. Faced with the purification, Lovia could only summon her Silver Knight evil spirit back and not let it out to graze. She could only use the corresponding Beyonder powers to make up for her weakness. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Silver beams of light occasionally blinked, flying at high speeds, forcing the Sun Saint to block and duck to protect himself. After taking a glance, Derek stopped brandishing Thunder God's roar again, nor did he pester the Sun Saint any further. He took a few steps back and cast his gaze towards the battle between the Black Great Sword and the Double Swords of Dawn. He then joined the battle between Colin Iliad and Anani. His expression turned solemn as he spread his arms wide, as though he was hugging a gift from a deity. The unshadowed domain immediately became even brighter, as though sunlight had penetrated through the barrier and shone in. Right on the heels of that, a ball of pure light surrounded by countless holy flames descended out of thin air. It enveloped Colin Iliad and Anani without any regard whether they were friend or foe. Flaring sun, of an unshadowed. This was the Urgical spell that Klein had used to kill Megos and the fetus in her womb. It caused tremendous damage to creatures in the domain of corruption, degeneration, and undying. It could even directly destroy them. In the holy spherical light that was surrounded by holy flames, the illusory black wings on Anani's back began to emit a faint mist. The pitch-black armor covering his body melted and part of his body cracked open, igniting his leaking degenerated aura. Colin Iliad was also injured. The silver armor on his body turned into liquid metal. Derek didn't pay much attention to this. He once again used Flaring Sun, and once again enveloped Enoni and Colin Iliad. He believed that compared to the enemy who was of the degeneration and corruption domain, the chief who was of the warrior pathway would suffer a lot less damage under the assault of Flaring Sun. He was able to last much longer. And after dealing with the main enemy, he could get Mr. World to summon Life's Cane to treat the chief. This was the fastest way to deal with Enoni. This wasn't something that Derek had come up with himself, nor was it part of the plan that Klein had come up with. It was something that Colin Iliad had suggested himself. Previously, when they were discussing outside the door, Klein had only introduced Enoni and the Shadow's possible abilities. He didn't come up with any proposals and had left it to the City of Silver's chief to decide on the battle plan. This was because he knew that Shadow understood him very well. He could think of anything he could think of. If it was based on his own train of thought, it would be easy to resolve. Therefore, trusting an experienced former demon hunter was the best solution under the present circumstances. Colin Iliad didn't stand on ceremony. He confirmed that the main target they needed to deal with was Enoni, who had been corrupted by the Dark Angel. He formulated a plan around this key point and came up with a plan to clinch victory through internecine means. He wasn't afraid of being hurt. He was only worried that there wouldn't be an opportunity such as this. The spherical light that was surrounded by infinite holy flames blasted down, illuminating the surrounding area. It made Klein's shadow dim significantly, making Anani's black wings become fainter and fainter, almost to the point of an illusion. But at this moment, a pair of black wings suddenly separated from Enoni and transformed into a deep sea. The deep sea swallowed the bright spherical light, darkening the entire, unshadowed domain. Silver bolts of lightning burst out from its interior, turning the area where Enoni and Colin Iliad were fighting into a forest of lightning. Amidst the sizzling sounds, countless bolts of lightning slithered upwards and drilled into the gaps in the armor. This Silver Knight, who had shown his incomplete mythical creature form, immediately turned stiff, as though he was paralyzed by lightning. As for Enoni, his black armor, which seemed to be formed from powers of degeneration, had completely absorbed the lightning, preventing his body from being affected by the rippling damage. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Enoni, who had pitch-black fragments peeling off from him, held the dark great sword with both hands and slashed at an angle. And at this moment, Colin Iliad hadn't completely escaped from his paralyzed state. With a piercing stabbing sound, a deep crack appeared on his left shoulder. The sturdy silver armor seemed to lose its defense as it was cleaved open by the great sword. This was a Black Knight's cull of spiritual flesh. Not only could it corrode flesh and blood, it could obliterate souls and cleave through barriers. It could also cause any living creature with degenerate thoughts to lose their defenses. It was a core beyond a power belonging to the Black Knight, stemming from the degeneration domain. Seeing that the cull of spiritual flesh had sliced open the silver armor on Colin Iliad's left shoulder, with the crack quickly deepening as it went straight for the heart, Derek tensed up and immediately condensed a spear made up of pure sunlight. He swung back his hand and threw it towards Enoni. Unshadowed spear. Enoni didn't abandon his attack or dodge. Instead, he raised his remnant illusory black wings and used them to shield himself. Sizzle. The unshadowed spear pierced through 2 layers of the illusory black wings, bursting out a blinding white light that seemed to give rise to a miniature sun. At the same time, Colin's entire body melted, turning into a pool of silver liquid metal. The liquid flowed rapidly, reforming the body of Colin Iliad in the distance. He still resembled a giant, and he was still wearing silver armor. However, half of the City of Silver's left shoulder and arm had fallen to the ground. The incision was clean with no blood flowing out. With the use of mercury liquefaction, Colin Iliad sacrificed an arm to avoid Anani's lethal blow. His gaze behind his visor didn't waver at all. He grabbed the remaining Sword of Dawn and ran towards his target once again. It was like an unusually terrifying steam locomotive that exceeded its speed limit. Derek quickly condensed his unshadowed spear, again from the side, causing the spears of light to fly towards Enoni. During this process, he opened his mouth and solemnly said, "God says that the purification is effective." This was the beyond powers of a notary at the unshadowed level. Its compatibility with the unshadowed domain created by the Sun Saint made the battlefield brighten even more, causing the degenerate auras on Enony and Lovia to further weaken. God said it's ineffective. The Sun Saint immediately denied Derek's proclamation, causing the unshadowed domain's purification effect to return to its former state. Amidst the crackling sounds, the unshadowed spear approached Enony. As for the black illusory wings on the Black Knight back, a few pairs had already faded under the miniature sun's illumination. He only had half left. Enony couldn't effectively dodge the pure, bright long spears closing in on him since his hands were full fending off Colin Iliad. He made a pair of illusory black wings spread out fully, disintegrating into darkness. As soon as the unshadowed spears came into contact with the darkness, they were stained with a layer of thick, sticky blackness. They either instantly corroded and broke, piercing the magnificent staircase, or left a curved arc in the air as it spun around and tore at Derek Berg. All of them degenerated at that very moment. Upon seeing this, Derek followed his battle instinct that he had honed from all his years of training and his patrolling and exploring experience. He jumped forward and rolled. Sizzle! Black spears landed behind him, corroding a large segment of the staircase. At this moment, the Sun Saint was also throwing unshadowed spears, creating pure white beams that shot across the air. This forced Lovia to use one of her grazed souls to constantly blink in an attempt to approach the enemy. To her dismay, she could only use the ability of one soul at a time in such a state. She couldn't blink while condensing Silver Rapier to cull the Sun Saint from a distance to create an opportunity for herself. Meanwhile, the battle between Klein and his shadow was exceptionally intense. Amidst the booming sounds of air cannons, the flaring of scarlet flames, pieces of paper scattering in all directions, and illusions turned into bubbles described the battle. The Silver Knight marionette had basically suppressed the Spectator Saint. After all, no matter how strong the Mind Dragon's body was, it wasn't a match for a demigod of the Giant Pathway when in close combat. Of course, the Spectator Saint wasn't in any danger. After all, he had revealed an incomplete mythical creature form. If it wasn't for the fact that his opponent was only a marionette, and Klein had already digested the Sequence 3 potion and seen many high-level creatures, he could use his exposed godhood to interfere with his opponent's thoughts, slowly driving him crazy and losing his rationality. Without the advantage of the godhood's influence, the Spectator Saint could only use the hypnotist's battle hypnotism to force the target to act erratically, such as attacking in the wrong direction. Using this opportunity, he escaped from the melee battle and entered a psychological invisibility state again in an attempt to perform a sneak attack on Klein. A hypnotist's battle hypnotism could forcefully hypnotize the enemy during battle, making him do all sorts of erratic actions. However, such actions couldn't directly cause harm to the victim, and it couldn't be maintained for too long, as the target would quickly wake up. Of course, the battle hypnotism target of the Spectator Saint was definitely not the Silver Knight marionette. This was because it was essentially a dead person. This made it immune to all psychological effects. The target of his interference was the thoughts Klein transmitted through the spirit body threads, targeting them so that the information the marionette received would be erroneous. As such, it would act differently from what Klein wanted. This was actually a psyche interference, and not a psyche hypnosis. The effects were undoubtedly not as effective as the original version, but not every saint of the Spectator Pathway could grasp such an effect. It was a result of digging deep into one's beyond powers and experimenting. To the Spectator Saint, there was nothing he could do about this. This was because, be it mind deprivation, mind storm, or mind breath, none of them were effective on a marionette. The grayish-white dragon that had its head covered in shadows had tried to close the distance with Klein several times, or to use its area of effect beyond the powers, but it was stopped by the Silver Knight marionette. It kept being forced to dodge the Silver Rapier, which could erupt within its body. As Klein controlled his marionette, he distanced himself from the Spectator Saint and dealt with his shadow. It wasn't too easy, but it wasn't too much of a burden. Suddenly, his spiritual perception was triggered as he entered a state of clarity unique to instances when his dream or mind secretly intruded. With his lucidity, Klein allowed a portion of his consciousness to rise to the sky and look down at his island of consciousness. Then, he saw Enony, the one who looked aged with a face covered in shadows, walk out of the boundless sea of collective subconscious, opening the door to his body of heart and mind. This spectator saint didn't attempt to change the island of consciousness in Klein's mind. All he did was produce a dark spherical light which had tentacles growing out of it. He turned it into a seed that was hard to discover before letting it sink into the ground. A mental plague seed. Without any hesitation, Klein immediately switched locations with the Silver Knight marionette, preventing the mental plague seed from landing in his island of consciousness. The spectator saint noticed this change. Not only was he not disappointed, he even revealed a smile. This was because he had long used virtual persona to secretly plant the mental plague seeds on the still island of the Silver Knight marionette. Although this couldn't affect the marionette, it could unknowingly corrupt the enemy who swapped positions with the marionette and other targets in the surrounding areas. This was a kind of corruption and infection that targeted the island of consciousness and the psyche. It wasn't a direct attack, so it was difficult to use virtual persona to offset it. When the time came, the problem that Klein had temporarily concealed with virtual persona would completely erupt. He would quickly plunge into a passage for losing control, entering an irreversible situation. Shadow was no stranger to such situations, as Vin Rambus had used such a method before. As he secretly laughed at Klein for becoming crazy, reckless, arrogant, and acting like a clown, one who had forgotten lessons of the past, he snapped his fingers, summoning a scarlet flame. He then used it to jump over, embroiling himself with Klein. Another round of paper shreds flew in all directions as the intense battle destroyed the afterimages. After a short while, Klein suddenly stopped. He raised his left hand that was wrapped with transparent maggots and covered his left face. Ha ha ha, ha ha ha. He let out a maniacal laugh, controlling the spirit body threads around him like a madman, no longer distinguishing between friend and foe. On his right cheek, pale meat tendrils protruded out, as if they were worms of spirit that were about to bore out. When Shadow saw that Klein had gone crazy and was about to lose control, he was worried that he would be infected by the mental plague. He hurriedly made a scarlet flame rise up and swallow himself. In the distance, his figure emerged from the flames that had yet to extinguish. At this moment, the Silver Knight marionette would occasionally launch an attack and occasionally do a twitching dance. It was obvious that it wasn't under normal control. He no longer had the strength to stop the mind dragon manifested by the spectator saint. He allowed the other party to spread out his wings and fly into the air above Klein. He was prepared to use mind breath. The spectator saint didn't want to give his enemy who was infected by the mental plague a chance to breathe. He wanted him to immediately lose control. Suddenly, this mind dragon's actions became sluggish, as if every joint was injected with glue. In the next second, a silvery white beam erupted from his body, splitting his flesh and blood, tearing apart his spirit body. With his back bent, the laughing Klein slowly straightened his body calmly. He released the palm covering his left cheek, and he smiled at Shadow in the distance. Behind him, wave after wave of silvery white beams tore apart the mind dragon, turning it into pieces of pitch-black flesh. They fell to the ground, and the knight marionette in silver armor retracted his broadsword and looked coldly at Shadow. Looking at the slightly lost Shadow, the few worms of spirit on his left face curled up and stimulated the curved corners of a smile. You haven't seemed to have noticed that I have something that you don't. As he spoke, Klein raised his right hand. A piece of pitch-black and filthy flesh had appeared in his palm at some point in time. It contained an indescribable aspect of madness. The answer is, the hanged man's corruption, Klein said to Shadow with a smile. The thing that he had that Shadow didn't was the corruption left behind by the true creator. This was an influence that even the power of Sephira Castle couldn't dissipate for the time being. And one thing he was certain of was that, before he met Dark Angel Sasria, the true creator wouldn't easily allow him to lose control or die. Therefore, he deliberately allowed corrupted parts of his body to be infected by mental plague, pretending that he had lost control. Then, he pretended to be controlling spirit body threads in an aimless manner so as to cover up the fact that the target was actually the spectator saint. When the opponent launched a further attack, he successfully entered a sluggish state, creating an opportunity for the Silver Knight marionette. As he expected, the corrupted parts of him wrapped around the seeds of the mental plague, preventing the negative effects from erupting. During this process, Shadow had distanced herself from Klein because of his concern about the effects of mental plague. This made him fail to notice the abnormality of the spectator saint's spirit body threads. How could Klein not know how careful and cautious he was? Of course, Klein couldn't predict the kind of changes the corruption would bring when he met Dark Angel Sasria. Would the mental plague that had been suppressed leak out and cause certain effects? All he could do was resolve the problems at hand. Upon hearing his words, the pure shadow suddenly burst into a scarlet flame that instantly engulfed him. At the edge of the unshadowed domain, near the place where the giant king resided, a wisp of fire rapidly rose up as Shadow appeared. He didn't hesitate to escape. He ran towards the palace, which acted as the resting chamber for the slumbering Dark Angel, completely ignoring Enony and the Sun Saint. When Klein, who was using his virtual persona, saw this scene, he was stunned. He couldn't help but smile with the worm of spirit and shake his head. "I'm actually that timid." He suspected that Shadow, which splintered off from him, had taken away most of his caution and carefulness, leaving behind more of his impulsiveness and recklessness. Ha! A silvery white beam lit up and smote the scarlet flames that descended outside of the unshadowed domain, shattering the pitch-black shadow that had just appeared. Klein hadn't wasted time muttering to himself. He had long controlled the Silver Knight marionette, then according to the distribution of the flames and his habits, he predicted the next few areas that Shadow would jump to. Then, he condensed, Silver Rapier, ahead of time and smote down the moment the flames descended. Unshadowed domain didn't have a barrier in the physical sense. Anyone could leave or exert influence on the outside world. However, the torn-up shadow eventually turned into thin pieces of paper and quickly disappeared. Another few burning scarlet flames descended, and the black shadow used them to jump, moving closer to the open door of the Giant King's residence. The silvery white light that subsequently tore him apart had only managed to take down his paper figurine substitutes. From Sequence 5, Beyonders of the Warrior Pathway had the ability to see through illusions. Without the aid of psychology invisibility, paper figurine substitutes were obviously more useful than illusion creation. It was only a situation when two seers were in combat that scenes of shredded pieces and illusions would occur. In just 2 or 3 seconds, scarlet flaming columns rose outside the Giant King's residence, as though they were releasing fireworks to welcome a guest. In the next moment, Shadow jumped into one of the flames and hid in the area where the Dark Angel lay in slumber. But at that moment, a figure quickly appeared in front of the scarlet flaming columns. He wore a black long trench coat and a half-top hat. His right face was normal, and his left face was formed from transparent and twisted maggots. It was none other than Klein's true body. The corners of his mouth curled up once again as he snapped his fingers with his right hand. Ha! The scarlet flaming columns were extinguished as the black shadow was forced to appear, returning to the staircase that was covered with the light of dawn. Flame controlling. The reason why Klein could rush outside the Giant King's palace to intercept Shadow ahead of time was because, after Shadow decisively fled, he was no longer able to effect his summoning of items from the historical void. He easily took out Creeping Hunger and switched to the Traveler's Soul. "It isn't a good thing to be too careful," Klein said to Shadow, doing so with a smile on his face. As he bent his knees, he arched his back. As he bent over, his figure suddenly became the knight in silver armor. The knight stabbed his broadsword into the ground and created an invisible barrier, sealing off the door to the Dark Angel's resting ground. At that moment, Klein swapped positions with his Silver Knight marionette. He gave Shadow the impression that he could enter the palace as long as he could destroy the Guardian's barrier. Of course, his true body interfered with Shadow's summoning of historical projections and controlling of spirit body threads. When the tables turned, the battle between the 3 demigods of the City of Silver, Enony, and the Sun Saint also changed. When Colin Iliad once again kept Enony, who had lost his black armor, busy, Derek repeated the previous strategy. At times, he would use Flaring Sun as an area of effect attack to trade injuries to the chief for a victory. At other times, he would condense a pure, white, unshadowed spear, and engage in precision attacks. This wasn't used often, because it was easy for Enony to avoid it, causing Colin Iliad to be accidentally injured. After 3 rounds of Flaring Sun, Enony finally reached the end of his rope. He once again spread out the last 2 pairs of illusory black wings, turning it into a pitch-black sea that devoured all light. He then drowned out Colin Iliad, causing the City of Silver's chief's body to be covered with a layer of thick black liquid. His actions were clearly affected. Seizing this opportunity, Enony escaped from the entanglement and avoided the subsequent, unshadowed spear. He transformed into a shadow and quickly moved towards the Giant King's residence in an attempt to join forces with Shadow to break through the barrier. At that moment, a silvery white beam burst out from his body, ripping him into blobs of dark red flesh. This sudden surgical strike came from Lovia. This six-member council elder had actually given up on dodging the attacks of the Sun Saint. At the instant Enoni was about to escape the battlefield, she decisively switched the grazed soul to the Silver Knight evil spirit, dyeing her black armor silver. Sizzle! The dazzling white and pure, unshadowed spear hit the lady, causing her to shrink slightly and the blazing sun to completely devour her. The blobs of flesh in Enoni's body remained sentient. They quickly gathered together in an attempt to rebuild the body. However, at this moment, the black sticky liquid restricting the movement of Colin Iliad exploded with specks of light. They turned into a storm and tore through the obstruction, allowing the silver armor to resurface. Right on the heels of that, the gigantified Silver Knight took a step forward and swung the Sword of Dawn in his hand, allowing a hurricane of light from before to continue sweeping forward, inundating the blobs of dark red flesh. A pair of illusory black wings appeared and dissipated, calming the hurricane of light. However, Derek's flaring sun continued. Holy flames ignited every blob of flesh and drop of blood, melting everything with pure light. When the Sun Saint saw this scene, he knew that it was impossible for him to escape the fate of being destroyed. He didn't bother dealing another blow to Lovia and turned around, about to withdraw from his unshadowed domain. Suddenly, he heard a voice filled with malice and corruption. Slow. Lovia struggled to free herself from the remnant powers of unshadowed spear, and teleported to a spot not far from the Sun Saint. Then, she switched the grazed soul to a devil and used the language of foulness. At that moment, the black armor on her body had completely shattered. There were many cracks on her purple-patterned black robe, revealing her slowly squirming flesh. Her aura was rather weak. The slow that wasn't at the level of a demigod couldn't affect the Sun Saint for too long. However, this was enough for Colin Iliad. He condensed a silver rapier and made it teleport to the enemy. This silver rapier experienced a random mutation. It directly pierced through the holy armor of the Sun Saint and exploded in his body. Silver light bloomed as the Sun Saint blasted into countless pieces. Pa, pa, pa. The flesh fell to the ground and vanished in a blink of an eye, as though they had returned to the pages of history. After the battle ended, the three demigods of the City of Silver immediately approached the Giant King's residence and pincered Shadow. Shadow leaped and attempted to hide in the fog of history. However, just as he saw the grayish-white fog, he was pressed down by a hand wrapped by transparent maggots. Neither him nor Klein dashed to the time before the first epoch, because they knew that the other party would definitely stop them or wait there. With nowhere to hide, Shadow immediately fell into the encirclement of the three City of Silver demigods. His various powers were also offset by Klein. Even Flaming Jump was affected by flame controlling, making it difficult for him to escape his predicament. More than 10 seconds passed. After the paper figurines were torn apart, Shadow finally expended all his substitutes. He was then stabbed in the abdomen by Derek's unshadowed spear. A round of blinding white light and a miniature sun exploded. The pitch-black shadow quickly faded and completely melted. Klein felt a stabbing pain in his head, and his mind, which was on the verge of losing control, suddenly relaxed. He instinctively looked to his feet and saw that under the illumination of the light of dawn, a faint black shadow extended out from them. Too weak, Klein bent his back slightly and couldn't help but mock himself. After all, without the powers of a scholar of yore, without a marionette, and without the ability to control spirit body threads, Aesir was relatively weak against other demigods of the same sequence. His spirit had been restored to its original state, but he had yet to remove the virtual persona. Furthermore, he had no intention of immediately summoning Miss Justice's historical projection to do this. As he had been corrupted by the Dark Angel, Enoni had shown the characteristics of the Sun, Spectator, Storm, and Secret Suppliant pathways. If he wanted to enter the Giant King's residence, he had to be wary of psychological influences. Virtual persona was a very good defensive measure. At that moment, the transparent maggots on the left side of Klein's body quickly settled down, returning to his flesh and skin. However, due to the crazy effects of his virtual persona, there was still a translucent layer on the surface, allowing people to see the worms of spirit hidden underneath. When Derek, Lovia, and the others cast their gazes on him, Klein straightened his back and reached out to grab Life's cane. He pointed at the open door of the Giant King's residence and laughed. Make every second count. The Dark Angel is waiting for us inside. Although Klein was urging them on the surface, he actually threw Life's cane to the bottom of the magnificent staircase and threw it at Lovia, allowing her to treat herself and Colin Iliad's injuries. As a former Rose bishop, Lovia was the least afraid of the negative effects of life's cane. Regardless of the changes in her body, as long as it didn't involve the spirit, she could treat them. At the same time, Derek quickly ran towards the collapsed battlefield in the middle of the stairs, picking up the severed arm of the chief. As long as a broken limb wasn't lost, life's cane could heal the injuries, restoring it anew. With an exaggerated smile, Klein nodded at Colin Iliad and leaped into the fog of history. He dashed to a time before the first epoch and hid in a fragment of light. Then, with a thought, he returned to Sephira Castle and sat at the seat belonging to the Fool. With the help of the crimson star corresponding to the Fool, which was constantly contracting and expanding, he checked the situation inside the Giant King's residence. However, under his true vision, there was a deep darkness inside, indistinct and indiscernible. As expected of the left hand of God. The deputy of heaven, a king of angels that is suspected to be related to the Chaos Sea. Klein sighed silently as he frowned slightly. He now suspected that, even if Little Sun entered the palace and prayed inside, it would be difficult for him to see the exact situation through the darkness. Unless he became an angel and truly gained ownership over Sephira Castle. In addition, Klein's spiritual intuition told him that there were still many unknown effects hidden in the slumbering grounds of the Dark Angel. He definitely couldn't be careless. He immediately reined in his thoughts and observed the situation around him. He searched for high-level existences like Adam and Amen, but he didn't find anything unusual. After letting out a breath, Klein hurriedly shattered the miracle invoker beyond a characteristic that he had separated from the curtain. He made the parts consisting of sequence 9 to sequence 3 gather together, making the sequence 2 portion pure. Then, he returned to the historical fragment and was once again affected by virtual persona, becoming more like a clown. In the next second, he left the grayish-white fog and reappeared in front of the door that opened into the residence of the Giant King. The Silver Knight marionette that had inserted the sword into the ground and created an invisible barrier immediately stood up. At this moment, the severed arm of Colin Iliad had already been reattached. Lovia had also recovered from her injuries. However, at some point in time, a few golden wheat heads grew from the back of her head and swayed. They walked to the door together with Derek and returned life's cane to Klein. After receiving it, he shook it and stopped maintaining the projection, making it vanish into thin air. Right on the heels of that, he made a grab with his right hand, intending to summon the historical void projection of Miss Messenger when she was in perfect condition. At this moment, Colin Iliad suddenly asked, "You plan on summoning that angel?" "It's not necessarily that one. I have too many choices." Klein spoke the truth in a slightly exaggerated tone. Colin had already dispelled his giant state and regained his original height of more than 2 meters. After all, maintaining an incomplete mythical creature form was still a huge burden to him. At that moment, he was wearing a silver armor he conjured. He held 2 swords that had returned to their normal sizes and said calmly, "That corrupted monster showed the characteristics of degenerating living creatures. The place where the Dark Angel sleeps should have similar effects. What the chief means is that the angel projection that Mr. World summons might rebel after entering the residence of the Giant King. And a fallen angel, even a projection, is easily able to make us pay a heavy price." Derek easily understood what the chief meant. On the other side, the flesh on Lovia's head was squirming as she enveloped the few wheat heads and fused them with herself. "Makes sense." Klein smiled and nodded, gently snapping his fingers. Then, he dragged out an ordinary raven from the fog of history, allowing it to fly past the open door and enter the dark interior. When the raven's figure was swallowed by the dark environment, Klein's eyebrows moved slightly. He turned his head and smiled at the City of Silver chief. "I've lost contact." Colin Iliad replied without any surprise, "That's a king of angels for you." Klein couldn't control the corners of his mouth from curling up. To him, this was a rather troublesome matter. It meant that he couldn't summon a historical projection to enter in his stead. The fact that his shadow had been sliced off also proved this point. "All right." As if stretching his wrists, he waved his hands a few times and took out a black staff with many gems embedded in it. 0 to 62, Staff of the Stars. He could only try to see if the sealed artifact projection and a marionette would degenerate and betray him. After all of them were prepared, Colin Iliad, Lovia, and Derek simultaneously cast their gazes towards the darkness behind the open door. Using the Staff of the Stars in his hand, Klein pointed ahead and said with an obvious smile, "This is going to be a dangerous journey. Everyone has a chance of dying. For you, and for me. With that said, he pressed down on his top hat and followed behind the Silver Knight marionette. Passing through the open door, he entered deep darkness. Colin Iliad, Lovia, and Derek didn't speak. They walked forward in silence and determination. Backland, in the battlefield outside the city. Using light to adjust her dragon transformation appearance, Audrey and the demigod in Phasation military uniform, who wore a mask and gloves, engaged in a fierce battle. The other party's impregnable defense, the broadsword that had been condensed from the light of dawn, the rapier's ability to hide and teleport, left a deep impression on her. If not for the fact that she knew that the upper echelons of Phazak and Intis were mostly Silver Knights, Demon Hunters, Iron-Blooded Knights, War Bishops, Unshadowed, Justice Mentors, Alchemists, and Arcane Scholars, and had gathered intelligence in advance at the Tarot Club and did some homework, Audrey, who lacked individual combat experience, would have long been defeated. Relying on her accumulated experience in this aspect, she managed to withstand the initial attacks and finally composed herself. Relying on battle hypnotism, mind deprivation, mind breath, and mind storm, she slowly turned the situation around and escaped her predicament. Of course, the most important thing was that the godhood brought about by dragon transformation had interfered with the Silver Knight's mind and thoughts. Furthermore, it allowed Audrey to possess a body that could withstand damage, as well as providing a power that could withstand attacks. Otherwise, she would have sustained injuries from barely being able to hold on. And as a Sequence 3 Saint of the Warrior pathway, this Phasation general had a strong will and uniqueness that was unaffected by illusions. He was able to effectively resist the effects of the mind and reduce the negative effects he received. Therefore, he still held the upper hand and used light concealment and Silver Rapier to suppress Audrey in an attempt to create an opportunity to defeat the enemy. Audrey was very calm about this. This was because, while fighting, she had already created a virtual persona. She had diverted her attention to the surrounding environment and had scattered many mental plague seeds. It wouldn't be long before the Phazak general was silently infected. At this moment, red flaming spears shot over from the Allied forces' base, blotting out the sky with the denseness. The Silver Knight didn't dodge. Instead, he took a step forward and swung his Sword of Dawn, keeping Audrey fixed to the ground. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The burning spears pummeled down one after another, blanketing the two demigods. Audrey's face could not help but distort. Charred marks covered her grayish-white scales of her dragon transformation body. As for the Silver Knight's armor, it was still glowing with silver light. It didn't suffer much of an impact. Compared to a giant, who specialized in defense, a dragon's ability to withstand blows was obviously much weaker. Only at this point did Audrey realize that she was participating in a war, not in a solo battle. When another wave of flaming spears was about to hit them, there seemed to be a commotion within the Allied forces' base, and there was a collapse to a certain degree. At that moment, the thick fog that enveloped the entire battlefield vanished, as though it had never existed. Audrey and the Phazak general stopped fighting at the same time, finding themselves abnormally weak. They even found it difficult to raise their arms. She saw that, behind the Allied forces' base, at the edge of the boundless plains, an orange-red ray of light rushed over, instantly covering half of the sky, blocking out the sun. The area around Backland instantly turned into dusk. The thick darkness appeared on another side of the sky and very quickly collided with the orange sunset. All the soldiers and officers on the battlefield fell to the ground and fell into a deep sleep. In Backland City, outside St. Hyland Cathedral, Leonard, who was wearing a red glove, looked up at the half-dark, half-dusk sky. His throat let out a silent sigh as he cast his gaze at the entrance of the St. Hyland Cathedral. The brown-haired Ekenza Bernard and the other members of the machinery hivemind stood there, staring blankly at the sky. Just a few months ago, they enjoyed a deep level of cooperation with Leonard's Red Gloves team. Together, they dealt with the evil forces in Backland, searching for the secret organization that believed in the Fool, the one that used tarot cards as a codename. At the bell tower of the Cathedral of Waves, the city of generosity, Biome, Danitz watched the resistance enter the city and take over many places. Finally, he heaved a sigh of relief and turned to Alja. Look, they're very popular in most places in this city. Alja's gaze followed the slightly dark-skinned natives as he didn't respond to Danitz. Danitz felt very relaxed as he chuckled and said, I never expected that we would meet again in such a situation. Alja looked up and was just about to say something when he suddenly felt something. He cast his gaze towards the northwestern sky. The place he was looking at instantly darkened. Layers of dark clouds formed and countless silver bolts of lightning snaked out. Many deep blue waves surged up and were swept up by the wind. They rushed towards the clouds and connected to the sea. Wherever the sea and the sky intersected, beams of light lit up. They weren't resplendent or clear, without any colors. They seemed to be formed from countless illusory objects. In a battlefield near the capital, Lemberg, the balls of compressed scarlet fireballs flew past the corpses, weapons, blood, and smoke, under the guidance of a flaming spear. They landed in the areas that were built with simple construction work, creating a series of explosions. As he watched the smoke rise and the flames spread, Anderson flung the dust in his hands and turned to the deputy beside him with a smile. "I wonder how much longer this will last. Any last words? I can help you write a will." As he had wished, he saw the angry looks of the militia around him. Their thoughts were uniform. However, the militia didn't attack. The glint in their eyes slowly settled as they cast their gaze in another direction. "You actually didn't respond to my provocation." Anderson pricked up his brows. "This means that you're planning something." Without waiting for the deputy and the militia to respond, the hunter smiled and continued, "Y'all are planning on surrendering, right? Are you trying to protect your family and friends?" Seeing gazes sweep over, Anderson tsked and shook his head. "You haven't become Beyonders for long. It's only through the war that you obtained the main potion ingredients from the enemy. Only then did you become hunters, provokers, and pyromaniacs. However, when it comes to plotting conspiracies, y'all are still too inexperienced. I'm very curious. Why don't you try to convince me to surrender together? I don't think I project the image of being very firm usually. Besides, I'm not a believer of the God of knowledge and wisdom." Having said that, Anderson looked thoughtfully at his deputy. "Is it because the enemy's brass is totally furious at me? They gave the order not to accept my surrender." The deputy remained silent for a few seconds before saying, "Since you already know, why are you asking?" With a swoosh, the nearby militia raised their right hands and aimed their palms at Anderson, appearing to have come to a collective understanding. "If I don't ask, how can I be sure what everyone's thinking?" Anderson said with a smile without panicking. He rubbed his stomach with his left hand and placed his right hand into his pocket. It was unknown what he was looking for. At that moment, the sun in the sky suddenly expanded and became extremely huge. The blazing golden sun made Anderson and company unable to open their eyes. They found it difficult to think any further. Immediately following that, an illusory tower appeared. Every level was made up of thick books. Each book had a brass eye on it. The higher one looked, the darker it became. It was filled with the aura of insanity, destruction, inauspiciousness, and disaster. The tower extended into the sky, as though it had encompassed the entire world within itself, including the gigantic sun. Backland, within the Adora family's luxurious villa. All the sanguine in the city had gathered here to prepare for the impending outcome of the war. Emlyn White, who had become an earl, had his hands in his pockets. He stood by the window, bathed in the mixed light of dusk and night as he watched members of his fellow race discuss the current affairs uneasily. Suddenly, his spiritual perception was triggered as he cast his gaze out the window. In the garden, a bunch of withered grass was dyed green once again. They rapidly grew and soon, they reached the height of a person. In other places in the city, some of the street-side trees that had not been affected by the previous bombardment were wildly absorbing nutrients from unknown sources. One by one, they rose up and soon grew to tens of meters tall. The branches were thick and the leaves were like umbrellas. These towering trees were connected to one another, covering half of the sky in Backland. Many buildings were crushed, or they were entangled by the branches and vines. It was as if they had been abandoned for more than a century. In just 7 or 8 seconds, many places in Backland had become a primeval forest. After passing through the open door and entering the dark interior of the Giant King's residence, Klein immediately observed the Silver Knight marionette in front of him, the Staff of the Stars in his right hand and Creeping Hunger on his left hand. They didn't show any abnormalities for the time being. The corresponding spirit-body threads didn't show any signs of degeneration. After confirming the situation in this area, Klein cast his gaze around and observed his surroundings. The place was enveloped by thick corporeal darkness. They couldn't see further than 5 meters away. The ground was paved with grayish-white bricks that looked like they were pieces of a frozen sunset. They didn't reveal anything extraordinary. After some thought, the corners of Klein's mouth curled up. He reached into the void, grabbed, and attempted to summon an angel. In the next second, he laughed out loud because he had lost a clear connection with the fog of history. This was the reason why the historical void projection he had summoned to enter had lost contact after entering this region. Laughing, Klein suddenly turned around and walked back to the area from which he had entered. "Mr. War, Sparrow, what do you want to do?" Derek, who was also scrutinizing the various restrictions on him, asked in surprise. Klein replied with a beaming smile, "Now is not the right time to explore this place. I plan to come in again later. Are you planning on summoning a sequence for historical projection and try to see if it will degenerate and betray you after you bring it in?" Colin Iliad said after some thought. Klein spread his left palm and said, "No one set the rule that we can't go out once we enter, or not being able to enter after leaving." Although in such a situation, Mr. World's words sounded a little strange, Derek still felt that it made sense. This was because the City of Silver had done the same thing when exploring the surrounding areas. Through repeated acts of entering and exiting, they gradually accumulated intelligence and details to finally resolve whatever problems they faced. Lovia didn't say a word or object. From her point of view, it was undoubtedly a good thing that she could make more preparations. In an exploration that determined the fate of the City of Silver, they definitely couldn't be rash. After taking a few steps back, Klein suddenly stopped and laughed out loud. "It looks like the owner doesn't want us to leave." The faint light at the door had already been devoured by the deep darkness and disappeared. Colin Iliad surveyed his surroundings and said, "We can only proceed forward." Seeing the chief and Mr. World turn around at the same time, Derek took a deep breath and raised his left hand, letting it emit a golden glow that illuminated the surrounding darkness. This revealed thick columns with indiscernible tops. Some of them had their silhouettes outlined, while others were hidden deep in the depths, barely visible. Derek retracted his gaze, preparing to head forward with Mr. World and Chief. At that moment, he failed to see another familiar figure from the corner of his eye. Derek's pupils dilated suddenly. Then, he quickly turned his head to look for Elder Lovia, who had been standing beside him moments ago. This demigod who believed in the true creator had disappeared. She had disappeared without a trace. Derek's abnormality was noticed by both Klein and Colin Iliad. At the same time, they cast their gazes at the spot and saw that the black-robed Lovia had disappeared without a trace, as though she had evaporated into thin air. With the spiritual intuition of a seer and the reconnoiter abilities of a demon hunter, they failed to realize when Lovia had gone missing, or how she vanished. The curl on the corners of Klein's lips grew even wider. Without any hesitation, his mind raced and allowed his spirit body to enter the world above the gray fog, combining with the dark red illusion of the Fool. Right on the heels of that, he cast his gaze towards the crimson star that symbolized the sun. He hoped to find clues through his true vision. However, everything was still obscured by the darkness. Nothing was revealed, just like how Klein predicted before entering the Giant King's palace. Without any time to think further, Klein immediately returned to the real world. In the span of 3 or 2 seconds, there was only Derek and the Silver Knight marionette by his side. The City of Silver chief, who was wearing silver armor, had disappeared. "What just happened?" Klein asked with a warm smile. Derek looked at him in shock, confusion, and panic. "Didn't you see it?" The moment he finished speaking, the shadow under Derek suddenly came alive. It rapidly extended upwards and enveloped him and the sunlight he emitted. After the shadow completely covered Derek, it fused with the surrounding darkness, no longer separable. Klein had originally raised his black staff to prevent an anomaly from happening, but in the end, he didn't do anything. All he did was watch with a smile. After a few seconds, he noticed that his body had turned black and dull, as though he was being melted by the environment. Similarly, Klein didn't try to save himself. The corners of his mouth curled up as he watched with a slightly shaking head. After his figure completely disappeared, his vision changed. The darkness was gone. The grayish-white stone bricks, the surrounding walls, and the huge pillars appeared clearly. They were covered in a layer of faint shadows. Outside the window, there was no sun, no moon, and no stars. However, a faint light shone through the window, making the entire palace appear sinister, dark, and cold. In the deepest part of the palace stood a very faint shadow, resembling curtains. Lovia, Colin Iliad, and Derek stood at a distance not far away from him. They carefully observed their surroundings as though they had come to another world. "Unfortunately, my marionette can't enter." Klein waved the staff of the stars in his hand and smiled at Derek and company. His indifferent attitude and the chief's calm and composed manner made Derek quickly calm down. He no longer allowed his fear and panic to grip him. Colin Iliad nodded slightly. Just as he was about to share his speculations, he suddenly felt something and turned to look at the deepest part of the palace. Klein, Derek, and Lovia did similar actions. In the deepest depths of the palace, that faint shadow dissipated, revealing a flight of steps meant for giants and an iron-black throne at the top of it. Sitting on a throne was a man with black, slightly curly hair that reached his shoulders. His eyes were covered in shadows, and his actual appearance was extremely blurry, preventing others from seeing him clearly. Layers and layers of black wings fell down from behind him, covering most of his body. The robe was black with silver threads embroidering it. They formed complicated patterns and had gorgeous accessories hanging on it. At that moment, the man had his left elbow on the armrest, holding up one side of his face with his palm as though he was in a deep sleep. Without needing anyone to make the introductions, the four demigods present clearly understood a reality. The giant-like man who was sleeping on the iron-black throne was the left hand of God, the deputy of heaven, Dark Angel Sasria. Amongst them, Lovia could clearly sense the oppression coming from this absolute high-level existence. It was like the response when praying to the true Creator. It was an aura that could cause her thoughts to scramble, her soul to degenerate, and her body to tremble. Suddenly, she heard a burst of laughter. She turned her head to the side in a daze. Klein bent his back slightly and laughed. He is still sleeping. Should we directly wake him, or wait for him to wake up? If we choose to wake him, how should we greet him? Hey, Your Highness Dark Angel. Rose Redemption Leader. These two questions sounded ridiculous and arrogant, but they had managed to shake off the influence of the environment and made Colin Iliad fall into deep thought. Just now, they had instinctively considered the first question. It was rather important, and it concerned their subsequent actions. Colin Iliad thought for a moment before saying, "Let's not wake him up for the time being. Try approaching him, and search for clues and information." That's my thoughts as well. With his left hand, Klein casually snapped his fingers and walked towards the black throne. At this moment, he felt fortunate that he had already taken care of Shadow and restored his spirit to its complete state. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to completely restrict his virtual persona. When he was imagining how to do the greeting, he almost blurted out, "Hi, Sassy." Seeing that Gehrman Sparrow had taken 2 steps forward, Lovia finally snapped out of her daze. "I'll give it a try using a grazed soul." This was a relatively safer method which wouldn't harm the expedition team. Klein nodded. With his black staff in hand, he turned to his side with a beaming smile. A 3 to 4 meter tall phantom image appeared in front of Lovia. A pair of goat horns lined with mysterious patterns sat atop its head. Its skin was black and matte, exuding a sinister fullness. It was a devil. It was different from the devils that he had seen before. Its body was covered with signs of decay, with yellow-green pus hanging off it, as though it was mixed with the power of degeneration. As Klein casually sized up the phantom image, the devil spread its huge bat-like wings, causing the light blue flames on it to burn even more vigorously, dissipating the strong smell of sulfur. It took a step forward, slowly approaching the iron-black throne and the staircase meant for giants. Using its intuition for danger, it surveyed the area for any abnormalities. While Colin, Klein, and the other demigods were paying attention to it, they also began scrutinizing the details of the shadowy palace. They discovered that behind the iron-black throne that Sasria was sleeping on, there was a pair of dim, grayish-blue double doors that depicted sunset. This might be the door that leads to the outside world. This thought flashed across the minds of the 3 City of Silver demigods, Colin Iliad, Derek, and Lovia. At this moment, the devil, who had traveled midway, suddenly paused. It was enveloped by a cluster of silver lightning and quickly faded away after being blasted to pieces amid crackling sounds. A pillar of light with swirling holy flames smote out of thin air, completely purifying the soul that belonged to the devil. Lovia didn't feel any pain from losing her grazed target. She only frowned slightly and couldn't think of a better way to probe the way. Klein looked around and said with an exaggerated smile, "As expected, I'm the man for the job." As he spoke, he slowly walked forward. As he took out a box of matches from his pocket, he lit them one by one and casually threw them around. "I've always been a little timid." After throwing half a box of matches, Klein turned around and explained with a smile. And even Derek Berg wasn't convinced by this sentence. Following that, under the illumination of the scarlet flames, Klein continued walking towards the iron-black throne that might have belonged to an ancient god. When he arrived at the spot where the devil's soul was destroyed, his left palm suddenly tightened. Klein lowered his head and saw that Creeping Hunger had returned to its human-skinned form. An exaggerated crack opened in his palm. Inside were 2 rows of illusory white teeth. This sealed artifact was attempting to gnaw at Klein's flesh in a bid to consume both his body and spirit. Creeping Hunger had degenerated. TSK. Klein let out an obvious sigh as he glanced at the staff of the stars in his right hand. He confirmed that the Grade 0 sealed artifact, which didn't have any living characteristics, had yet to show any abnormalities. He then raised his right hand and stuffed the other end of the staff of the stars into Creeping Hunger. Creeping Hunger bit at it a few times before it finally calmed down when sensing the suppression effect of a higher-level entity. After laughing twice, Klein took another few steps forward, covering a few meters. Cracks suddenly appeared in the shadows that covered the walls, pillars, and tiles, as one brass eye after another grew out. A figure appeared in front of the countless eyes. He was first presented as the black-haired, light brown-eyed, and cold-looking Gehrman Sparrow. Following that, he warped into the black-haired, brown-eyed, scholarly-looking Klein Moretti with ordinary looks. Then, he degenerated into a blurry image, and a grayish-white fog emanated from him. At this moment, these figures that seemed to expose all of Klein's secrets came to a halt. Boom! He exploded, transforming into countless illusory fragments that fell to the ground and disappeared. Klein raised his brows and TSKED with a laugh. The omniscient power of the reader pathway. Just as he finished speaking, the brass-colored eyes, which grew out from the surrounding shadows and the ground, trembled. They emitted an ethereal voice that seemed to come from ancient times, the aura of Sephira Castle, Sephira Castle. Colin Iliad seemed to recall something and came to a certain realization. It's only possible to get a response or approach Sasria with a Sephira. That's why, despite the Hanged Man clearly having Lovia, a demigod believer from the City of Silver, he still forced me into the palace to meet the Dark Angel. It wasn't easy for Klein to control his virtual personality's instinct to speak. Before he could consider what to say, the brass eyes hidden in the shadows emitted another voice. Your fate has intersected Ammonises, Leodero, Adam, Aemon, Herabergen, Orcuses, Medici, Ouroboros, as well as him, with regards to the true names that the brass eyes had mentioned. Colin Iliad, Derek, and Lovia were no strangers to the names. They knew that the first was the Evernite goddess, followed by 7 of the 8 kings of angels. Furthermore, there was no lack of Sequence 0 true deities in the present day. This left them somewhat stunned. They couldn't believe that Gehrman Sparrow would have crossed fates with so many high-level existences who exceeded Sequence 1. Together with the sleeping Dark Angel before him, Mr. World and the 8 Kings of Angels had already crossed paths. How impressive. Derek marveled from the bottom of his heart. Klein was in no mood to quip about his divine interpersonal skills. With an obvious smile, he asked, him. Klein believed that him referred to the true creator. After all, he still had his corruptive influences left in his body. The brass eyes on the shadowy curtain fell silent for a few seconds before saying with an ethereal voice, he is another me. The true creator was really another side of the ancient sun god. The side that was born from the god's corpse. It's a side filled with hatred and viciousness, one that controls degeneration. Klein gradually drew an equal sign between the black and gloomy infant sitting in the cavity of the ancient sun god's chest and the true creator. He had also gained initial confirmation that he was talking to the psyche left by the Dark Angel Sasria. He thought about it and couldn't help but smile. Why did you form Rose Redemption to assassinate the ancient sun god? The information that the question revealed was something that Colin Iliad and Lovia already had an inkling and some speculations of. However, after hearing Gehrman Sparrow say it with their own ears, they still felt pangs of depression and confusion. The curtain that covered the walls, stone pillars, and floor tiles trembled, but the sleeping Dark Angel remained motionless. Those brass eyes stared at him and said, Sun God is just my original honorific name. You should now address me as, the Lord who created everything, the omnipotent and omniscient God, or God Almighty. I can tell that you've been leaning in that direction all this time. Finally, Klein laughed out loud. Then, he felt a lingering fear. This was because he was mocking heaven's deputy, the left hand of God, a king among kings of angels, as well as his true form. To not anger the other party, he quickly repeated the question, so, why did you betray yourself and form Rose Redemption with the Evernite goddess to assassinate yourself? The brass eyes fell into silence once again. The curtain-like shadows that blanketed various areas swayed gently without stopping. After a few seconds, the ethereal voice slowly said, "The primordial one had awoken in my body." Upon hearing this answer, Klein's pupils dilated. For some reason, he felt his hair stand on end as his back turned cold. It was very close to his guess, but it was even more terrifying. At this moment, the shadows around him thickened. It became more and more sinister and gloomy, as if it was giving birth to some terrifying, unknown, redoubtable danger. Although Colin Iliad, Derek, and Lovia didn't understand the meaning of Dark Angel Sasria's words too well, they were still affected by the sinister and harrowing words. It left them shuddering in fear as they trembled. "The primordial one had awoken in my body." These words echoed in the air for a long time.